Imagine it's very late at night, or very early in the morning. The kind of hour where the world feels quieter than usual. The kind of hour when the sky is that particular shade of dark that isn't quite black, where sounds carry differently, where time moves strangely. There's someone in a room somewhere, maybe by lamplight, maybe just the glow of a screen, opening an old book. Not a new book, an old one. The kind of book that costs more than most people would spend on a single purchase, but less than it should cost for something with this kind of weight. The pages have that particular smell, that texture of paper that's been handled for decades, maybe centuries. Yellow at the edges, soft from use. And they're reading the opening of the book of Genesis, the beginning of the world according to thousands of years of human story. And if you've heard these words before, listen to them again. Let them settle into your mind like water into soil. And the words go something like this. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth, and all was formless and void, until God said, "Let there be light." And then God planted a garden in Eden, toward the east. And out of the ground the Lord made every tree grow that is pleasing to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And there's a river flowing out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it parted and became 4 headwaters. And the names of these rivers are the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Now, listen to that list for a moment. 4 names, 4 rivers, sit with that for a moment. The Tigris, the Euphrates. We know those rivers. They're on the map. They flow through Iraq and Syria today. They have names on every atlas. They have histories written down in multiple languages. They're real concrete places you could visit if you wanted to. Places where cities still stand, where people still live, where water still flows as it has for thousands of years, through the same landscape that ancient people walked through. But the Pishon, the Gihon, those names don't match any rivers we can find on any modern map. Not in Turkey, not in Iraq, not in Egypt, not anywhere in the modern world. Search for them on a satellite image and you'll find nothing. Ask a geographer about them and they'll tell you, those rivers don't exist. At least not anymore. Not under those names. Not in any form we can identify. They've vanished, either from the world, or from memory, or from both. For thousands of years, for all of human recorded history really, people read these words and assume this must be mythology, pure story, a spiritual metaphor, not a description of an actual place. Because how could a text written thousands of years ago describe a real geography with 2 rivers we recognize and 2 we don't? It doesn't make sense. It feels like dream logic. Like the kind of story a parent tells a child at bedtime that doesn't need to map onto the real world, that operates by different rules. It's meant to soothe, to mystify, to transport you somewhere other than where you are. It's meant to feel true emotionally, even if it isn't true factually. It's meant to create a mood, a feeling, a sense of wonder and loss. And for a very long time, that's exactly what scholars thought. They treated Genesis as mythology. Beautiful mythology, yes. Profound mythology. Important mythology in the way that all stories that shape civilizations are important. But mythology nonetheless, separate from history, separate from what we could verify, what we could measure, what we could dig up and examine under controlled conditions in a laboratory. The Garden of Eden was relegated to the realm of the purely symbolic. It represented the human condition before sin, the state of innocence before knowledge, the lost paradise that all of us in some way carry in our deepest memories. That's what the story was for. Not to locate a place on earth, but to locate a feeling in the human heart. The memory of a time when things were simpler, better, easier. The nostalgia that every person who's ever lived has felt at some point. The sense that we've lost something important, that we've been exiled from somewhere we belong, that we're living in exile from a garden. But here's what's strange. Here's where things start to get interesting. Here's where the story takes a turn that science fiction writers dream about, but which turns out to be history. In the last 30 years, really in just the last generation of scientists and archaeologists and geneticists, something has started to happen. Evidence has been appearing. Real evidence. Archaeological evidence that you can hold in your hands. Genetic evidence that you can read in the code of DNA. Climate evidence from ice cores and pollen samples. Evidence from the ground itself, from the soil, from the artifacts buried in the earth. And it's suggesting something that sounds impossible at first. something that feels almost like it shouldn't be true because it violates the comfortable division we've made between myth and history. That the story of Eden might actually be based on a real place. Not divine creation, but a real event in human history. Not a metaphor, but a folk memory. A story passed down through thousands of years of oral tradition, shaped and reshaped and spiritualized as it travelled through time, as it moved from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, until it became what we now read in Genesis. A story that remembers something true, something that actually happened. And the story it might be remembering is not the creation of the world, it's something more specific than that, something more human. It's the memory of the moment that changed everything for humanity. The single most important transition in human existence. The moment when we stopped hunting and gathering and started farming. When we went from following the animals across the land, from gathering what the earth offered freely and abundantly, to settling down in one place, planting seeds, waiting for crops, building structures, creating civilization. When we went from living in abundance that we didn't have to create, to living in the work of our own hands. When we went, in other words, from a garden that provided for us to a garden we had to tend and defend and organize ourselves around. From Eden to everything after. From the world of plenty to the world of sweat and labor and structure and hierarchy. From being the gardeners of nature to being the gardeners of culture. From freedom to responsibility. Think about that transition for a moment. Let it sit in your mind. If you were an ancient person living through it, or if you were a person hundreds of years after it happened, remembering stories that your grandparents' grandparents had told around fires on nights like this one, you might describe it exactly like this. We had a garden. The garden provided everything we needed. Everything. There were 4 rivers. The land was fertile. The animals were abundant. The plants grew without us having to do anything except know where to find them. The sun rose and set. The seasons turned, and we lived within those rhythms as easy as breathing. But then something changed. Slowly at first, then faster. The world shifted. The climate changed. The animals started disappearing, or they moved elsewhere. Or we had to compete harder for them. We couldn't go back. We couldn't return to what we had been, and so we had to work. We had to build. We had to plant. We had to organize ourselves into societies. We had to create the complex structures that would eventually become civilization. We had to invent hierarchy and government and law. We were cast out, the story says, or we left, or both. But the garden, the memory of the garden, stayed with us. It haunted us. It made us nostalgic for something we could no longer have. And maybe that's why, 12,000 years later, people were still telling the story, still trying to understand that moment, still trying to make sense of the loss. The place where this transition actually happened, where this great turning point in human history occurred, is called the Fertile Crescent. Picture a map of the Middle East in your mind. Not a political map with all the countries and borders, but a map of the land itself. The topography, the water sources. Now imagine an arc of land curving from the Persian Gulf, up through Iraq, up through Syria, across the top through Turkey, and down the western edge of the Mediterranean through what is now Israel and Egypt. That arc, that crescent-shaped band of relatively fertile land in the middle of deserts, that's the Fertile Crescent. And it's the most important piece of land in human history, arguably, because this is where wheat was first domesticated. This is where humans first figured out how to take wild grain, to observe it, to select for size and yield, to plant it intentionally, to wait for it to grow, to wait with patience through the seasons, and to harvest it. And in doing that, they created the abundance that would support the first settlements. This is where humans first stayed in one place long enough to build permanent structures. This is where the first villages grew up. This is where the first cities were built. This is where writing was invented, where government was invented, where the complex hierarchies of civilization were invented. This is where astronomy was studied and recorded, where mathematics was developed, where art was created. For thousands of years, archaeologists have known this. It's the cradle of civilization. It's where we came from, in a sense, not genetically, but culturally. Not where humans originated as a species, but where humans organized themselves into the complex structures we recognize as civilization. Where humans, in a way, became us. Became the kind of beings who write and read and remember and tell stories. But one particular region keeps appearing in the stories. One place keeps showing up in every origin story, every ancient text, every layer of human memory that archaeologists dig into. And it's in southeastern Turkey, right at the headwaters of the Tigris and the Euphrates, the exact region described in Genesis, the exact region that would make geographical sense if you were trying to describe a garden with 4 rivers, 2 of which are the Tigris and the Euphrates. This isn't coincidence. Or if it is, it's a very strange one. These are the rivers that are named. These are the rivers that are known. These are the rivers that define the region. And this is the region where they begin, where they come out of the ground. In the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, where the land is green and the water is abundant. In 1994, at a site called Göbekli Tepe in that very region, in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains in what is now southern Turkey, about 20 kilometers from the Syrian border, in a landscape that's rocky and sparse in places, but which carries within it the memory of abundance, archaeologists made a discovery that changed how we understand not just Eden, but the entire story of human civilization. A discovery that forced scholars to question everything they thought they knew. What they found was a temple complex, a structure made of stone, but not just any stone. Massive T-shaped pillars, some reaching 7 meters high, that's about 23 feet tall, taller than a house, taller than most trees, arranged in circles, multiple circles, concentric rings of standing stones. The stones were not squared off and fitted together with mortar, the way later civilizations would build. They were standing stones, set in the earth, arranged with precision and intention, carved with symbols and meaning, some bearing reliefs of animals, scorpions with their tails curled, snakes slithering, wild boar with their tusks, foxes, spiders, the animals of that region, the creatures that lived there in abundance, immortalized in stone. And here's the thing that made it extraordinary, the thing that made archaeologists sit up and take notice, the thing that made them realize they'd stumbled onto something that would force them to rewrite the history books. It was 12,000 years old. Radiocarbon dating confirmed it. Scientists tested the materials. They tested them again and again. The results were consistent. This temple complex was built 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years. That's 6,000 years before the pyramids, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 6,000 years before writing was invented, 6,000 years before cities, a long, incomprehensible stretch of time before any of the things we associate with civilization. And this matters. Listen to the timeline. This matters because agriculture, the domestication of wheat and barley and legumes, didn't develop until about 10,000 years ago. Cities didn't develop until about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Writing didn't develop until about 5,000 years ago. So here was a monumental structure, a building that required organized labor, that required planning and coordination, that required a society complex enough to undertake such a project, that required the existence of a shared belief system, a shared culture, a shared mythology, a shared understanding of what was sacred and important, built 2,000 years before anyone had figured out how to farm, built before agriculture, built before cities, built before writing. It didn't make sense. According to everything archaeologists thought they knew, according to everything that had been taught in universities for generations, it couldn't exist. The timeline was wrong. The sequence of events didn't match the archaeological record. The narrative of human progress didn't allow for this, and yet it did. It existed. They could touch it. They could measure it. They could carbon date it. It was real. And from that discovery at Göbekli Tepe, and from decades of research since, from 1994 all the way to the present moment, all the way to now, a new picture has started to emerge. A picture that's still being refined, still being debated, still being explored and challenged and defended by archaeologists and scientists around the world. But a picture nonetheless, a coherent narrative that explains what was happening. And that picture suggests something profound. The Garden of Eden might not be a place at all in the way we typically think of places. It might be a time, a memory, a folk story passed down through thousands of years, through 10,000 years of human oral tradition. Stories told around fires, parents telling children, children growing up and telling their own children. Stories changing and adapting and evolving as they move through time, as they move through generations, as they moved across language barriers and cultural boundaries, until they became mythology, until they became scripture, until they became the opening words of the Bible, the oldest book that survives to us. And the time that's being remembered might be the time before the change, the time of abundance without the burden of work, the time of hunting and gathering when the world provided for humans. All they had to do was understand the seasons, know where to look, know when to harvest what was available, and take what the land offered freely. They didn't have to plant. They didn't have to harvest. They didn't have to organize labor. They didn't have to create bureaucracies to manage water and resources. They didn't have to invent writing to keep track of debt and obligation. They just had to live. That time, the archaeologists and climate scientists suggest, is what we lost, or what we left behind. Not through divine punishment, as the story says, not because we ate the fruit we were told not to eat and angered a deity, but through choice, through necessity, through the slow, inexorable realization that the climate was changing, that game animals were becoming scarce, that the Ice Age was ending, that the world was becoming drier, and that if humans wanted to survive, if they wanted to continue living in that region, if they wanted to maintain their presence in this sacred land, they had to figure out something new, something they had never done before. They had to learn to farm. And in learning to farm, they had to give up the freedom of the hunt and the gathering. They had to settle down. They had to organize. They had to submit to the demands of crops and seasons. They had to become civilized. And maybe the memory of that loss, the memory of leaving the garden, the memory of the abundance that ended, was so profound, so important, so culturally significant that it got passed down and passed down and passed down from generation to generation, from parent to child, around fires and at bedtime and during long walks through the countryside, until 10,000 years later, long after the transition had happened, long after civilization had been created, long after cities and kingdoms and empires had risen and fallen and been forgotten, someone decided to write it down. They put it into words, they gave it structure, they made it scripture, and it became the opening of the Bible, the first story, the foundational myth, the memory of Eden. If you're using this to fall asleep right now, that's exactly why I make these videos. These long meandering stories that don't have a quick ending, that reward you for staying with them, that give your mind something to chew on so it can stop chewing on the things that keep you awake. The anxiety, the worry, the nagging sense that something's not right. These stories replace that circular thinking with something else. With narrative, with mystery, with the slow unfolding of a world that's not your world, with the understanding that what we're living through now is not new, that humans have always been trying to understand our place in the world, our relationship to what's sacred, our loss of what came before. Maybe if you're enjoying this so far, you could subscribe to the Calm Archive. It really does help me keep making these long-form sleep stories, these deep dives into history and mystery, and the strange knowledge we carry about our own past. And if you don't mind, I'd love to know in the comments, if you ever comment, where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's genuinely fascinating to see people from all over the world listening to these stories during the quiet hours. Insomniacs in Tokyo watching the city wake up while listening to Eden. People trying to rest in London at 3 a.m, that impossibly dark hour. People in South America listening while they're falling asleep, while the night is still young. Night shift workers in Australia taking a break. Someone who works all night and is listening to this story about the end of the Ice Age while they think about whether their job is sustainable, whether they can keep doing this forever. Students across Europe pulling an all-nighter on these words instead of on energy drinks and desperation. It's this strange, quiet community of people who value these kinds of stories, who seek them out, who choose them in the late hours when they could be doing anything else, and I really do appreciate knowing you're there. It makes the work of researching and writing these scripts feel like it matters, like it's not just words floating into the void. But anyway, back to Eden. So to understand why scientists and archaeologists have started taking seriously the possibility that Eden was based on a real place and a real time in history, we need to go back. We need to go deeper. We need to go back 12,000 years to the end of the last ice age. We need to understand what the world actually looked like, what the climate was doing, what the land was like, why southeastern Turkey, right at the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates, was such a special place that humans kept returning there, kept hunting there, kept building there, kept leaving artifacts and temples and eventually writing down stories about it. We need to understand the actual history of the Fertile Crescent before civilization became what we recognize as civilization. We need to understand the world that Eden might have been, the garden before the fall, the time before the work, the time before the structure, the time when abundance was free, and that's where we're going next. That's the world we're about to enter together. That's the story we're about to tell. Imagine stepping back 12,000 years. The ice sheets that once covered much of the northern hemisphere have begun their slow retreat. The climate is warming, and with that warmth comes transformation. The world is thawing, and in this thaw, something remarkable is awakening. The landscape you would encounter in what we now call the Fertile Crescent during this period would astonish anyone accustomed to the controlled, ordered agricultural world we inhabit. This is not the manicured garden of paintings, or the formal orchards of the Renaissance. This is wild, abundant, generous beyond measure. This is a region where nature had perfected the art of generosity over thousands of years, a place where the fundamental conditions of human survival had been solved by the earth itself, not through human labour, but through the simple, profound arrangement of climate and geography and time. The Fertile Crescent at the end of the last ice age was not a frontier waiting to be tamed. It was a civilization in its own right, though not in the way we typically use that word. It was a civilization of abundance, of plenty, of what early 20th century anthropologists would later call the golden age of the hunter-gatherer. The wild grains, wheat and barley, grew not in rows planted by human hands, but in vast, undulating fields that stretched across hillsides and valleys. These were not domesticated plants carefully tended and defended. These were wild species, reaching their fullest expression, thriving in their native climate. The harvest could be extraordinary. A family might spend a week gathering enough wild grain to sustain themselves for months. Archaeological evidence shows that the people of this region, the Natufians, would harvest and store these grains in stone-lined pits, and this surplus allowed them a level of security that many modern humans would envy. This is a crucial point, one that fundamentally changes how we understand this period. These were not subsistence living peoples barely scraping by. They had surplus, they had storage, they had security. The animal life was equally extraordinary. The gazelle populations in particular were so abundant that they seemed limitless. Imagine herds moving across the landscape, thousands of animals, dust rising in the distance as they passed. Aurochs, those magnificent wild cattle with their massive horns and powerful frames, could be found in smaller numbers, but were still a substantial source of nutrition. Wild boar roamed the forested areas, and the rivers, those full rivers that ran with seasonal abundance, teemed with fish. The protein was not something that had to be hunted with desperation or ingenuity. The landscape provided. That is the simplest way to say it. The landscape provided. Hunts would be successful. The tools were effective. The knowledge of animal behaviour was refined over countless generations. A hunter pursuing a gazelle or ambushing a boar at a watering hole was engaging in a learned skill, yes, but it was a skill that worked. The success rate was higher than we might imagine, higher certainly than the desperation and struggle that we often project onto ancient peoples. The Natufian people, living in this region between approximately 12,500 and 9,500 years ago, had developed a level of settlement and stability that was quite remarkable for the period. They were not purely nomadic, constantly moving from camp to camp in a restless search for resources. They had semi-permanent villages, stone houses with real walls and roofs, social structures, rituals, and art. They were the last great flowering of the hunter-gatherer way of life before agriculture transformed everything. This was not a primitive existence in the way that word is often used, laden with assumptions about suffering and brutishness. These were people with culture, with complexity, with a deep knowledge of their world and their place within it. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of specialized craft production, of trade networks that extended across considerable distances, of symbolic practices that suggest spiritual and intellectual sophistication. These were not simple people. They were people who had solved the problem of survival in such a way that they could turn their attention to other things. The tools they created show remarkable sophistication. Bone hooks and harpoons for fishing, stone blades with edges sharper than modern surgical steel, grinding stones for processing grains, mortars and pestles for crushing nuts and seeds. Each tool represents innovation, experimentation, problem-solving. The settlement of Jericho in the Jordan Valley, which would later become famous as one of the first cities, was already an established Natufian settlement during this period. Not the great walls that came later, but a settlement of round stone houses, a community of people who had chosen this particular place as home and built their lives there. Other settlements existed throughout the region, each adapted to its local environment. Some were closer to the rivers, some were in the foothills where the wild grains grew most abundantly, some were in areas where the hunting was particularly good. The Natufians had developed a detailed knowledge of their landscape, of the seasonal movements of animals, of when and where the various plants would ripen. This knowledge was not written down. It was carried in memory, in oral tradition, in the practices and rituals of daily life. It was perhaps more reliable than written knowledge, tested through thousands of years of successful living. A Natufian elder would know which valleys the gazelles returned to in spring, would know the days when the wild grain would be ready for harvest, would know which roots could be eaten and which were poisonous, would know the stories of past droughts and past abundances and how people had survived them. This accumulated knowledge was the true wealth of the Natufian society. Consider what a day might have looked like for a Natufian during this period. You wake in a stone house, surrounded by family. The sun is rising. There is no urgent work demanding your immediate attention. You do not have fields that need watering or weeding. You do not have livestock that need feeding or herding. You eat a meal, perhaps bread made from ground wild grain, perhaps fish if the river is close, perhaps meat that was hunted days before and preserved. You may work. The women would gather plants, grains, nuts and berries. The men might hunt or fish. But the work is not desperate. It is not the 8-hour grind of the agricultural labourer, toiling from dawn until dusk under the sun. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, which have survived into recent centuries in remote areas, suggest that the Natufians might have spent 3 to 5 hours a day in food acquisition activities. 3 to 5 hours. This is not a guess. This is based on careful anthropological observation of peoples who lived similarly, peoples who were studied in the 20th century before modernization swept away their ways of life. The Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer groups, spend approximately 4 hours per day on food acquisition. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia, before colonisation, were documented by anthropologists as having a workday that was remarkably short. The San people of southern Africa, studied extensively in recent decades, followed similar patterns: 3 to 5 hours of focused, productive work and then rest, then leisure, then the activities that had nothing to do with acquiring food. The Natufians, living in an environment that was arguably more abundant than the environments of modern hunter-gatherers, would likely have had even more security, even less pressure to work constantly. The remaining time, and this is crucial to understanding the appeal of this way of life, was leisure. Free time. Time for art, for music, for storytelling, for the deepening of relationships, for play, for rest, for sleep, for simply being. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. The Natufians left behind not just tools and food storage facilities, but bone flutes, carved figurines, elaborate burials with grave goods and pigments that suggest ritual and spiritual practice. They had time to create beauty. They had time to engage in activities that had no survival purpose. They had time to sit and listen and think and dream. This is not a fantasy. This is evidence-based history, carefully reconstructed from material remains. The concept that emerged in academic circles in the 1960s, and has only grown in credibility since, is that of the original affluent society, a term coined by the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins. The idea is counterintuitive to anyone raised in the modern world, where scarcity and competition are the fundamental conditions of existence. Sahlins argued that hunter-gatherers were not poor, they were not struggling. They were not on the edge of starvation, managing resources through heroic effort. Instead, they were affluent. But their affluence was not measured in accumulated possessions or stored wealth. It was measured in abundance and leisure. They had what they needed. They had time. They were not competing with one another for scarce resources in the way that competition is celebrated and enforced in modern economies. The landscape provided enough, and this abundance created a fundamentally different relationship with work and with time and with the concept of enough. In the modern world, enough is a dangerous word. Enough suggests completion. Enough suggests that you could stop working, stop competing, stop acquiring. The economy depends on the constant creation of insufficiency, on the perpetual sense that you need more. The Natufians lived in a world where enough was real. They had enough. They could stop. The health data supports this assessment, and this is where the argument becomes particularly powerful, because it is measurable, quantifiable, provable. Skeletal analysis of Natufian remains shows that these people were generally taller than the first agriculturalists who came after them. They had better teeth. They suffered from fewer nutritional deficiencies. Their bones show less evidence of disease and stress. They lived on average reasonably long lives. Yes, infant mortality was higher than in modern populations with advanced medicine, but those who survived childhood could expect to live into their 60s or 70s. In a world without antibiotics, without modern surgery, without the vast medical infrastructure we take for granted, this represents robust health. The people who would come after, the first farmers, would be shorter. They would have worse teeth. They would suffer from more diseases. They would show more signs of nutritional stress on their bones. The shift to agriculture, which we often celebrate as progress, as the beginning of civilization, as the foundation upon which all modern achievement is built, came with real costs to human health and well-being. The bones do not lie. They tell the story of a people who were healthier before they began to farm. The environment itself was a marvel of provision, a landscape that supported human flourishing without requiring the transformation and manipulation of nature that would come with agriculture. The rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Jordan, and smaller watercourses that no longer flow with such abundance due to modern irrigation and climate change, ran full with seasonal rains and snowmelt from distant mountains. Fish were abundant. The water itself was clean and available, not requiring the wells and irrigation systems that farming would demand. The forests that covered portions of the landscape provided not just habitat for game animals, but also nuts, berries, and other plant foods. Pistachio trees grew wild, date palms bore fruit, almonds could be gathered. The grasslands supported the herds of gazelle and other ungulates. The hillsides had the wild grains, concentrated in areas where the climate and soil were particularly favourable, waiting to be harvested. It is difficult for someone raised in a world of climate instability and environmental degradation to imagine, but this landscape was stable. The climate was favourable. The rains came reliably. The rivers flowed. Generation after generation could follow essentially the same seasonal patterns, knowing that the world would provide. This is not a world of chaos or danger. This is a world of rhythm and reliable abundance. The social world of the Natufians, from what we can discern through archaeology, was relatively egalitarian. There is little evidence of significant wealth accumulation or social hierarchy of the kind that would characterize later civilizations. The graves, even those with grave goods and elaborate burial practices, do not show the kind of extreme differentiation that would indicate a ruling class or a priesthood that lived dramatically better than others. The stone houses, while varying somewhat in size, are not so different from one another that we can clearly identify some people living in palaces while others live in hovels. Leadership, when it existed, appears to have been based on skill or knowledge or personal qualities, rather than inherited power or accumulated property. The person who was skilled at hunting or gathering, the person who had accumulated knowledge about seasons and animals, the person who was perhaps a healer or a spiritual practitioner, these people would have been respected. They might have had some authority or influence. But this was not power in the coercive sense. This was not authority backed by force. The absence of coercive hierarchy was possible precisely because the fundamental conditions of life did not require it. When there is plenty, when everyone's basic needs are met, when the landscape provides abundantly, when no one person can accumulate enough power to dominate everyone else, because there is no scarcity driving the competition for resources, there is less pressure to accumulate, to dominate, to hoard. Power structures emerge when they are functionally necessary, when someone needs to organize labor or enforce distribution, or defend against scarcity or control the use of critical resources. The Natufians did not have those pressures. Not yet. They could afford to be relatively equal because the earth was generous enough that no one needed to be anyone else's master. The artistic traditions of the Natufians reveal a people who were not just surviving, but creating, not just existing, but expressing. Bone flutes have been found at archaeological sites, flutes that could produce musical notes, that could create art from air and breath. Figurines carved from stone or bone suggest ritual practices, spiritual beliefs, the creation of objects that mattered for reasons beyond the practical. Elaborate burials suggest that the Natufians were concerned with the afterlife, with the proper honouring of the dead, with meaning beyond the material world. The use of ochre and pigments in burials suggests a sophisticated understanding of symbolism and the desire to mark the sacred. These are not the behaviours of people who are desperate, who are barely surviving, who have no time for anything but the acquisition of food. These are the behaviours of people who have time, who have security, who can invest energy in things that matter to the spirit as well as the body. The daily life would have been embedded in rhythms, in patterns that repeated and created meaning. The seasonal movement might be less dramatic than that of purely nomadic peoples, with the semi-permanent villages serving as home base where people returned again and again. But the season still mattered profoundly. Spring brought certain resources, new growth, new game animals returning from their winter grounds, fish beginning to move up the rivers to spawn. Summer brought heat and different resources. Autumn was the harvest season, when the wild grains had ripened and the gathering work became more intensive, but it was intensive work that lasted weeks or months, and then concluded. Winter was quieter, a time when people gathered in larger groups perhaps, a time of storytelling and craft work and the deepening of relationships. The calendar was written in the body of the land, in the movements of animals and the ripening of plants, in the behaviour of rivers and the cycles of the sky. This is not primitive. This is sophisticated. This requires knowledge. This requires observation. This requires culture passed down through generations. A child born into a Natufian village would spend years learning the knowledge that kept the community alive, where the plants grew, when they ripened, how to process them, how to find animals, how to hunt them, how to preserve meat, how to recognize the signs of seasons, how to read the landscape. Imagine standing in this landscape if you can. You're standing on a hillside. Behind you and before you and stretching toward the horizon, grasses sway in a warm breeze. The air is rich with the smell of growing things, dry grass, dust, and something green and alive. In the distance, you can hear the sound of a river, not the roar of a flood, but the constant murmur of water moving over stone, a sound that speaks of abundance, of continuity, of the reliable provision of the earth. The sky is vast and blue, the sun is warm on your skin. There are birds everywhere, the sound of their calls, the flash of their wings as they move through the air or land in the grasses. If you listen, really listen, you might hear the sound of a human voice, singing perhaps, or speaking, or laughing. There is a settlement nearby, a cluster of stone houses where people are engaged in the ordinary activities of living. Someone is grinding grain between two stones, the rhythmic sound of work that is engaged in but not desperate. Someone is working with fibre, making clothing or baskets or nets, their hands moving with the confidence of long practice. Someone is tending to a child, not in distraction but with presence. Someone is resting in the shade of a structure, sleeping perhaps or simply lying in the warmth of the day. Someone is carving something from bone, creating an object that will be beautiful, that has no practical purpose beyond the making of beauty itself. Someone is sitting with someone else and they are talking, and there is ease in their posture. The sounds of this landscape are not the sounds of industrial civilization. They are not the sounds of machinery or traffic or the constant low hum of electricity and power. They are not the sounds of crisis or hurry. They are natural sounds layered with human sounds that are not frantic or driven. There is bird song. There is the murmur of the river. There is the wind in the grass. There is the human voice. There is music, perhaps. A bone flute creating sounds that were beautiful then and would still be beautiful now. There is the sound of work done at a human pace. There is silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of quiet. The kind of quiet that exists when people are not constantly pushing, not constantly running, not constantly trying to produce and accumulate and achieve. There is sleep. There is rest. There is the sound of a community, which is the sound of humans being together without need or desperation, without a deadline or a quota or a goal that has to be met by sunset. This is not magical. There are no miracles here. There is no paradise in the sense of a place where suffering does not exist or where all desires are instantly fulfilled. There are still injuries and illnesses. There is still pain. There is still the loss that comes from death. There are still conflicts between individuals and between groups. There is still envy or anger or disappointment. There is still the fundamental reality of being human, which includes pain and challenge and the need to work and the awareness of mortality. There is disease. There is the injury that comes from accident or violence. There is grief. But this is a kind of paradise in a deeper sense, a paradise not of the absence of difficulty, but of the presence of security and community and time. This is a place where the basic conditions of flourishing have been met. Food is reliable, shelter is available, community is present and valued. Time exists for activities beyond mere survival. There is security, there is leisure, there is the possibility of beauty and meaning and connection. This is what humans might have created if the only pressure was to live well, not to accumulate, not to dominate, not to grow endlessly. This is what the mythological Eden might be a folk memory of, not a magical garden, but a real historical world where humans lived in genuine abundance and relative peace for thousands of years. This was the world that would be remembered, transformed through the lens of language and time and spiritual significance into the story of the Garden of Eden. Not as a literal description, but as a memory encoded in myth and story. A memory of a time before toil, a memory of abundance without struggle, a memory of leisure and connection, a memory of a world where food grew on trees and in fields without your labour, where rivers flowed with fish and water, where the landscape was generous and the future seemed secure. This memory would be transmitted from generation to generation, first through oral tradition, then through written text, growing more elaborate, more symbolic, more laden with spiritual meaning, but retaining at its core this echo of something real. Something that had actually happened, something that people had actually lived. The Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis is described as a place where you could eat freely from the trees, where you did not have to labour, where you walked with divine presence in the cool of the evening. Strip away the theological language, and you have a description that matches the world of the Natufians. Strip away the miraculous elements, and you have the world of the pre-agricultural Fertile Crescent. But something happened, something changed, and the change would transform everything. It would transform human society. It would transform the human body. It would transform human relationships to the earth and to each other. It would transform time itself, from the rhythm of seasons and the abundance of leisure to the clock time of labour and obligation. And the evidence of this change, the physical proof that the Natufians and their world had existed, was being slowly buried under a hilltop in Turkey, under layers of dirt and stone and ash, waiting to be rediscovered. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we return to that hilltop and what lies beneath it, we need to understand what triggered the change. We need to understand why humans would abandon this abundance, why they would trade leisure for labour, why they would choose to farm, why they would trade the security of a proven way of life for the uncertainty and difficulty of agriculture. The answer involves climate, crops, and a choice, or a series of choices, that did not seem like the beginning of the end of human leisure. But it was. The answer also lies in the fact that the Natufians themselves, in their sophistication and their knowledge, contained within them the seeds of their own transformation. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd named Savak was walking across a limestone hilltop in southeastern Turkey, in a region that straddles the border between Turkey and Syria, when something caught his eye. Protruding from the earth were shapes, angular, deliberate, carved. The stones seemed too intentional to be natural, too carefully placed to be accident. He couldn't have known that he'd just stumbled upon one of the most profound mysteries in human history, or that his discovery would fundamentally reshape how we understand our own origins, our ancestors, and the birth of everything we call civilization. Word of the finding eventually reached the ears of Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist who specialized in the prehistoric Near East, and when he arrived at that hilltop and saw those stones for himself, something shifted in his entire understanding of human potential and human purpose. What he would spend the next 2 decades uncovering would challenge virtually every assumption that scholars held about the prehistoric world and the nature of human consciousness itself. Schmidt knew from that first moment that he'd encountered something extraordinary, something that would change everything. What unfolded over the following decades was an excavation that would change archaeology forever. Beneath the soil, team after team of workers uncovered massive T-shaped pillars, towering monoliths that rose up to 18 feet tall, carved from solid stone, each one weighing as much as 20 tons or more. These weren't small stones, these weren't simple markers or practical tools. These were monuments in every sense of the word, arranged in deliberate circles like a gathering place, like a temple, like a space designed specifically for human beings to come together for something greater than themselves. And as the earth was carefully removed, the pillars revealed something even more stunning. They were covered in carvings, intricate, detailed animal carvings that had been etched into the stone with remarkable artistry and precision. Lions prowled across the surface, their bodies carved with fluid lines that suggested movement and power, muscles tensed as if they might leap from the stone at any moment. Foxes appeared, captured in moments that felt almost alive, their ears alert, their eyes focused with an intelligence that transcended the stone. Serpents coiled and twisted in patterns that seemed to dance, their scales rendered in careful parallel lines that created texture and dimension. Vultures with wings spread wide, their feathers depicted with meticulous attention to detail, dominated entire sections of the pillars. Scorpions with tails raised in aggressive postures, their stingers sharp and threatening, their bodies compressed into stones as if caught in an eternal moment of tension. Wild boar with tusks depicted with such care that you could almost see the tusks gleaming with menace. The carving of each animal shows knowledge, intimate knowledge that comes only from living alongside these creatures, observing them, understanding their nature. Every animal held meaning, every carving told part of a story that reached back across millennia into the minds of the people who created them. The artisans who carved these figures possessed not just technical skill, but a profound understanding of their subjects. They knew how these animals moved, how they stood, what their essential nature was. The carvings speak to a people who lived closely with the natural world, who observed and understood it, who valued it enough to carve it into stone for eternity. When you examine individual pillars closely, you begin to see distinct artistic styles and different hands at work. Some of the carvings are delicate and intricate, with fine parallel lines creating texture and dimension. Others are bolder, with deeper cuts that would have required more force and taken longer to complete. Some pillars feature animals alone, while others show animals interacting with one another or with abstract symbols. There's a pillar where a lion appears to be attacking or dominating a smaller animal, suggesting a narrative beyond mere representation. There are abstract T-shapes and geometric patterns that might represent human figures, or might carry spiritual significance we can no longer fully understand. There are spirals and concentric circles, lines that flow like water or wind. There are symbols that might represent the stars or constellations, marks that might encode astronomical knowledge or spiritual truths. The human figures themselves, carved in T-shaped form on some pillars, have a haunting quality. Were these ancestors? Were they gods? Were they representations of spirits or guardians of the sacred space? The T-shape is so deliberate, so consistent across the site, that it surely held profound meaning to the people who created it. Some scholars propose the horizontal bar represents outstretched arms in a gesture of embrace or worship. Others suggest it might represent specific human figures of spiritual significance, perhaps shamans or spiritual leaders. The fingers carved on some of these T-shaped pillars, rendered with such detail and care, suggest that hands held meaning in the ritual life of Göbekli Tepe's builders. Did worshippers touch these hands? Did pilgrims place their own hands against the carved fingers as an act of communion or blessing? Did the act of touching the stone create a connection between the living and the sacred? The stone itself, smooth in some places and rough in others, shows the incredible labour invested in creating these monuments. You can trace with your eyes the path the carver took, the direction of the cuts, the way the light and shadow play across the carved surfaces. This is craft. This is intention. This is sacred labour. The process of creating these pillars would have been extraordinary in its difficulty and its coordination. Workers would have first selected suitable limestone from the hillside or from quarries nearby. The quarrying itself would have taken weeks or months. Stoneworkers would have used tools of flint and stone to identify natural weak points in the rock face, then would have carefully struck the stone along these lines to fracture and separate large blocks. Imagine the sound of thousands of strikes, the dust rising in clouds, the careful precision required to not shatter the stone into useless rubble. The quarrying would have been dangerous work, with workers labouring at heights, working with heavy stone, risking falls and crushing injuries. Once a suitable block was separated, it would have to be transported to the site. No small feat given the weight and the terrain. Multiple workers would have been needed. Ropes of plant fibre, if available, or leather hides, would have been used to secure the stone and drag it across the ground. Wooden sledges might have been used. The effort would have been immense, the coordination complex, the planning meticulous. Teams would have had to work together in perfect synchronization, pulling and pushing, guiding the massive stones up the hillside. Once at the site, the real work would begin. The basic shape of the T would have been roughed out. Then, with patient strikes, using flint tools that would have required constant replacement as they dulled, workers would have refined the edges, created the shape, and prepared the surface. The flint itself would have had to be knapped, carefully shaped into tools of the right size and sharpness. Each flint tool would have been used until it dulled, then replaced. Thousands of flint tools would have been used in the quarrying and shaping of each pillar. The ground around the site would have been covered with the chips and fragments of stone and flint, evidence of the tremendous effort expended. Only then would the carving of the animals have begun. Each animal figure would have been sketched or marked out, perhaps using ochre or charcoal to outline the form. Then, with patient strikes, using the finest flint tools, workers would have carved the image into the stone. The carving would proceed stroke by stroke, line by line. A single animal carving might take weeks of focused effort. A fully carved pillar, with dozens or hundreds of individual carving marks, might have taken months or longer. And there wasn't just one pillar. There were dozens. There were multiple temples. The cumulative labour is almost incomprehensible. The investment of time, effort, resources, and human labour suggests something more than a casual religious gathering place. It suggests a centre of extraordinary importance, a location that drew people and resources from a vast region. When radiocarbon dating was performed on the organic material found at the site, the results sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. This site, which came to be known as Göbekli Tepe, meaning belly hill in Turkish, dated back to approximately 9600 BCE. Let that number sink into your mind for a moment. Roughly 11,600 years ago, when mammoths still roamed the earth, when the Ice Age had only recently released its grip on the Northern Hemisphere, when human beings were still, by all conventional understanding, simple nomadic hunter-gatherers following herds and gathering plants and roots from the landscape around them, someone built this. This monument predated the pyramids of Egypt by 7,000 years. It existed a full 6,000 years before the people of ancient Britain would arrange the massive stones of Stonehenge. Göbekli Tepe is, without question, the oldest monumental structure ever discovered on Earth, and that fact alone forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about human capability and human motivation during the prehistoric period. The entire framework of human history had to be rewritten. What archaeologists had believed to be the natural progression of human society, that religion came after cities, that cities came after agriculture, that all monumental construction required a settled agricultural society with specialized labor and central authority, was shown to be completely wrong. The picture was inverted. Religion didn't come last, it came first. The desire to gather in sacred space, to build temples, to express spirituality through monumental construction, this came before farming, it came before cities. It was the foundation upon which civilization would eventually be built. Here's where the story becomes even more remarkable. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. They had no agriculture, they kept no domesticated animals, they had no established cities or permanent settlements, they made no pottery, they had no metal tools, they carved these massive pillars using flintstone implements and pure determination. Flint is a hard material certainly, but nothing compared to the limestone they were carving. The effort would have been staggering. Each strike, each carefully measured blow, would have taken hours of focused work. The T-shaped pillars alone, each one would have required weeks or months of labour, carried out by multiple workers, coordinated and determined. And there wasn't just one pillar, there were dozens. There were circles of them, temples arranged in patterns that suggest careful planning and architectural vision. Tower structures may have stood at the centre of some of these circles, creating a visual focus for the gathering space. The scope of the undertaking becomes clearer the more we examine it. Hundreds of workers would have been necessary to complete this site. Not one season of work, but sustained labour carried out over generations. The people returned again and again, year after year, to expand and add to the structures they had begun. For people without permanent settlements, this meant planning. This meant knowing they would return to this same location multiple times. This meant organizing labor across generations, with knowledge passed from elder to younger, with understanding that the work begun by one generation would be continued by the next. This required social organization. It required the ability to plan for the future. It required shared understanding about what was important enough to devote centuries to building. This raises a fundamental question that challenges everything we thought we understood about prehistoric life. How did hunter-gatherers, people with no permanent settlements, no written language, no centralized authority, coordinate and organize a project of this magnitude? How did they convince hundreds of people to commit months or years to a single endeavor that offered no obvious practical benefit? There was no roof to shelter them from rain. There was no storage structure for food. There was no fortress to protect them from enemies. This wasn't utilitarian. This was something else entirely. The answer, according to Klaus Schmidt and the researchers who have continued his work since his passing, is that Göbekli Tepe was a temple. Religion, Schmidt proposed, came before agriculture. Religion came before cities. Religion came before civilization itself. The desire to gather in a sacred space, to participate in ritual and worship, to honor something greater than the individual self. This drive was so powerful, so fundamental to human nature, that it may have actually catalyzed the invention of farming itself. Think about the logic of this revelation for a moment. If you're a hunter-gatherer, you're mobile, you follow the herds, you gather plants seasonally. Your food supply is relatively secure because you've adapted to that lifestyle over tens of thousands of years. Agriculture is actually harder than hunting and gathering in many respects. Farming tethers you to one location. It requires you to work dawn to dusk during harvest seasons. It makes you more vulnerable to famine and disease. Why would anyone voluntarily give up the relative ease of hunter-gatherer life for the grueling work of farming? But if there's a temple that draws people from all the surrounding regions, if hundreds of people gather there multiple times a year for religious ceremonies, for festivals and rituals and celebrations, then suddenly you need to feed all those people. You need a surplus of food. You need to store grain and domesticate animals. Farming becomes necessary. The sacred drive to worship, to gather in community, to honor the divine, may have been the very spark that ignited civilization itself. Religion created the conditions that made agriculture necessary. The pillars themselves hold clues to the beliefs of the people who built them. Many of the T-shaped stones appear to represent stylized human figures, the vertical bar of the T resembling the torso, the horizontal bar representing outstretched arms. Some of these pillars have fingers carved into them, hands depicted in careful detail reaching outward into the air. Were these ancestor figures? Were they representations of gods or spirits? Were the people of Göbekli Tepe carving images of their dead, honoring the departed members of their community, creating a space where the living and the dead could commune together? The carvings suggest a complex spiritual life, a society that thought deeply about identity, about representation, about the invisible world that exists beyond the material and the seen. The consistency of the T-shaped form across the site suggests it held ritual or spiritual significance. These weren't random shapes. They were intentional, repeated, meaningful. The people who carved them knew what they were creating and why. Some of the pillars show what appear to be belts or decorative elements around the waist of the T-shaped figures, suggesting clothing or status markers. Others have carvings that might represent eyes or faces within the upper portion of the T. The careful attention to the hands is particularly striking. Fingers spread wide, sometimes holding what might be tools or objects, sometimes simply reaching. These hands seem to invite touch, to welcome interaction, to suggest a relationship between the living visitor and the carved figure. Imagine standing before such a pillar, raising your hand to touch the stone hand carved there, feeling the warmth of the stone in the sun, connecting across time to the intention of the carver. This was sacred act. One particular pillar, known as Pillar 43 or the Vulture Stone, has captured the attention of researchers for decades. On its surface is carved a scene of unusual complexity. A vulture appears to be carrying away a headless human figure. Other birds and animals surround the scene, creating a narrative tableau that seems to depict a moment frozen in stone. Some researchers have proposed that this pillar might depict an astronomical event, a comet strike or meteor, rendered in the symbolic language of the people who witnessed it. The Younger Dryas, you'll remember from earlier in our journey through this mystery, was a period of catastrophic climate change that occurred roughly 12,800 years ago. Göbekli Tepe was built in the aftermath of this event, in the period of climate stabilization that followed. Is it possible that the people of Göbekli Tepe, still living in the shadow of that cosmic catastrophe, memorialize the event on stone? Is it possible that the comet or meteor that had fallen in their collective memory was preserved in this carving, retold in myth and image? The headless figure might represent a person struck down by cosmic force. The vulture, a scavenger that consumes the dead, might represent transformation or the transition from life to death. The other animals surrounding the scene might tell a story of how the natural world responded to this cataclysm. The answer remains elusive, but the possibility opens our minds to the depth of thought and memory that existed in prehistoric societies, to their ability to process and memorialize significant events, to translate physical experience into symbolic form, to preserve important memories in stone for future generations. As we examine the pillars more closely, we begin to see patterns of meaning and intention that suggest a highly organized cosmology, a worldview in which the natural and spiritual realms were intimately connected, in which animals held profound significance, in which the act of carving and building and gathering held deep ritualistic power. The arrangement of the pillars in circles suggests that Göbekli Tepe was a gathering place, a liminal space where the sacred and the mundane met. The hunters who came there would have walked into the circles of stone, surrounded by the carved animals that watched from the pillars all around them. The experience would have been overwhelming, transformative. Imagine it for a moment. You're a hunter from a distant region, and you've heard stories from other travelers of a sacred place, a hilltop where the ancestors have built temples. You journey there, over hills and across valleys. As you approach, the stone pillars become visible, rising from the earth like sentries guarding the threshold between worlds. You pass between them, and suddenly you're surrounded by carved lions and serpents and boar, all rendered in stone, all watching you with an intensity that seems almost alive. The sunlight falls across the carvings, creating shadows that seem to animate the figures. The scale of it all, the size of the pillars, the precision of the carvings, the evident investment of labour and skill, communicate something powerfully about the beliefs of the people who built this place. This is a space of power. This is a space of the sacred. This is where something important happens. The ceremonies that took place here, whatever their exact nature, would have been profound experiences. People would have gathered at times of seasonal significance. Animal bones found at the site suggest that feasts took place here, that people ate together, that they shared food and community. Rituals would have involved movement through the space, perhaps circumambulation around the pillars, perhaps the performance of dances or the recitation of stories. The encounter with the sacred would have shaped souls and changed how people understood their place in the universe. And this feeling, this profound sense of the sacred, this desire to return again and again to experience it, may have been powerful enough to reshape human civilization itself. The pull toward this sacred center, the need to gather there, to participate in whatever ceremonies and rituals took place, may have begun the process of social reorganization that would eventually lead to agriculture and cities and everything that came after. Religion was the force that pulled humans together, that made them willing to coordinate, to invest effort, to plan for the future. Religion was the foundation of civilization. But here's where the story takes an even more mysterious turn, a twist that few people know about, and that raises questions that still perplex archaeologists today. Sometime around 8000 BCE, roughly 1600 years after Göbekli Tepe was first built and expanded and elaborated upon, something happened. The people who had built this temple, who had devoted centuries to its construction and maintenance, who had gathered there for religious ceremonies and rituals, they stopped coming. And more than that, they deliberately buried it. They filled in the temple with earth and stone, carefully covering the pillars and the carvings, preserving them in a protective layer of soil. This wasn't the natural process of time and weathering. This was intentional. This was a deliberate act of closure. The site wasn't abandoned because people moved away to more fertile lands, though they did. The site was sealed. It was covered. It was, in a sense, given a funeral. The sacred space that had drawn people from across the region was hidden away, buried, put to rest. And in the generation or two that followed this intentional burial, something shifted fundamentally in human society. Agriculture began to spread across the Fertile Crescent. Permanent settlements began to appear. Pottery was invented. The social structures that characterized civilization began to emerge. The hunter-gatherer way of life, which had sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years, began its slow decline, replaced by the agricultural societies that would give birth to Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley civilizations, and ultimately to all of recorded history. It's as if the closing of the temple, the burying of the sacred space, marked the end of an era. As if the people themselves understood that something was changing, that the world they had known was ending, and they chose this moment to perform one final ceremony, one final ritual act, the burial of their most precious creation. Perhaps they left offerings in the buried chambers. Perhaps they performed one final ritual before the earth was piled upon the stones. Perhaps they wept for what was being lost. Why would the builders of Göbekli Tepe bury their most sacred space? Some researchers suggest that the burial was a form of ritual closure, a way of honouring and farewell to a way of life that was ending. Others propose that the site was buried to preserve it, to protect it from the very changes that were about to sweep across the landscape. Perhaps the people understood, at some level, that the world they knew was ending, that the era of the hunter-gatherer was drawing to a close, and they wanted to preserve their most precious creation for a future age. Perhaps they feared that the new ways, the farming, the settlements, the growing hierarchies and authorities, would profane or destroy this sacred place. So they chose to bury it, to seal it away, to return it to the earth from which its stones had come. Or perhaps there's a simpler explanation. Perhaps the site was buried to contain its power, to seal away a sacred space that had become too potent, too transformative for the new agricultural societies that were emerging. Religious sites across cultures have sometimes been sealed or covered as a way of honouring them, of acknowledging that a particular era or chapter has ended. The act of burial itself becomes a ritual, a final ceremony, a way of saying goodbye to something precious and irreplaceable. Whatever the reason, the fact remains that Göbekli Tepe was deliberately hidden, and its hiding coincided with one of the most transformative moments in human history. When the site was finally unearthed more than 9,000 years later, it brought with it not just stone and carvings, but questions that continue to haunt us, that continue to challenge our understanding of who we are and where we come from. It stands as silent testimony to a sophisticated, spiritually motivated people whose religious impulse gave birth to civilization itself. But here's where the story takes a profound turn, because after Göbekli Tepe came the fall, and we can see it in the bones, we can measure it in the skeleton. The moment humanity ate from the forbidden fruit, the moment paradise ended, wasn't a moment at all. It was a process that unfolded over centuries, and it was written into the very structure of human bodies. Let me take you back to that moment when the climate shifted, when the world changed overnight, and everything humanity had known began to crumble. The Neolithic Revolution. This is what archaeologists call it, and it's the single most important event in human history. It's the moment when humans stopped following the animals, stopped gathering wild plants that grew freely around them, and started for the first time deliberately planting seeds. They began the work of farming. They bent their backs to the earth. They dug. They planted. They waited for growth. They reaped. This transformation spread slowly across the world, first in the Fertile Crescent, then in China, then in Mesoamerica. Within 10,000 years, farming had become the dominant mode of human existence. But here's what the textbooks don't tell you. Here's what the bones tell us. The switch to farming wasn't progress. It wasn't an improvement. It was a catastrophe. A catastrophe dressed as progress. A trap that locked humanity into a pattern of labour and suffering that we've never escaped from. Because the first farmers, the very first people who gave up the hunter-gatherer life, they were, without exception, worse off. They were sicker, they were shorter, they worked harder, and they lived less well. We know this from skeletal analysis. Archaeologists have examined thousands of skeletons from before and after the agricultural revolution, and the pattern is undeniable, consistent and striking in its clarity. When you compare the bones of people who lived as hunter-gatherers to the bones of the first farmers, the difference is immediately apparent. The hunter-gatherers of the pre-Neolithic, the people who lived in the world of abundance in the Garden of Eden of human history, they were on average taller than the first farmers, 2 to 4 inches taller in some populations. They were stronger. Their bones were denser, suggesting better nutrition and less stress on their bodies. Their skeletal structures show the signs of robust health. Their bones show fewer signs of disease, fewer stress fractures, fewer indicators of malnutrition. Their femurs and other major bones show clear signs of robust musculature, suggesting strong, well-developed bodies capable of sustained physical exertion, but not the repetitive strain injuries common in agricultural peoples. Their teeth were better. They developed fewer cavities. Their tooth enamel was thicker and stronger. The wear patterns on their teeth suggest a varied diet of tougher, more nutritious foods, nuts, roots, meat, requiring substantial chewing effort but providing comprehensive nutrition. And the work they did, while certainly it required skill and effort, didn't consume their entire existence. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, the few that remain, suggest that people in these societies spent about 15 to 20 hours a week obtaining food. The rest of their time was leisure, ceremony, art, sleep, play, rest, music, making love, teaching children, sitting in the sun. They lived well. They lived with a rhythm tied to seasons and natural cycles, with time for rest and recovery, with space for culture and community and spiritual life. Life expectancy at birth was reasonably good for the era, typically reaching into the 60s or 70s, especially if you survived childhood. They had leisure to create art, to make music, to develop complex spiritual practices. They had time to simply be alive. The first farmers, by contrast, worked constantly, sun up to sundown in many cases, ploughing the earth. This is back-breaking, repetitive labour. The skeletal remains show the damage in heartbreaking detail. Stress fractures in the spine from the repeated impact of digging and ploughing, the body jolting again and again against hard earth and stone. Arthritis in the joints from repetitive motions, the same movements done thousands of times, grinding away at bone and cartilage. Deformed spines from carrying heavy loads, from bending over crops for hours in the sun, from the cumulative strain of years and decades of agricultural labour. The vertebrae themselves show signs of compression and collapse, the bones wearing away from years of stress. The pelvis shows deformities suggesting heavy labour and poor nutrition during childhood, indicating that the agricultural stress began in childhood and continued throughout life. Their bones are shorter overall, indicating that their bodies didn't develop normally, that nutrition was inadequate for proper growth. The bones are less dense, suggesting nutrition that wasn't sufficient to maintain bone health. The tibia and fibula show thickened areas suggesting constant stress, the body's attempt to reinforce bones under constant pressure. The hands and feet show deformities from repetitive work. The shoulders show damage from carrying and throwing, and their diet, which consisted heavily of grain, lacked the nutritional variety of wild plants and hunted meat. So they developed malnutrition. Skeletal analysis reveals indicators of iron deficiency anemia, the telltale signs visible in the bones themselves, changes in bone density and structure that reveal internal nutritional deficiencies. They showed signs of vitamin deficiencies, particularly vitamin C and D deficiencies, that came from a restricted diet. Their teeth decayed from the high carbohydrate content of grain, with cavity rates sometimes reaching 20 to 30% in populations that had been farming for just a few generations. Some early farming populations show evidence of tooth loss from cavities before age 20, meaning people lost their teeth while still young. Their children were smaller, born to malnourished mothers whose own bodies were being depleted by the demands of farming and childbearing. The size differential between successive generations indicates that the nutritional stress was immediate and severe. Their lifespan was shorter. Life expectancy for the first farmers was actually lower than it had been for the hunter-gatherers they replaced. This is what farming did. This is the trajectory of human health and well-being when agriculture replaced hunting and gathering. The price paid was illness, shorter lives, smaller bodies, harder work, and less leisure. This is what the Genesis story calls the curse, and the language is so precise, so exact, that it's almost startling to read it knowing what we know about the archaeological record. After the expulsion from Eden, God says to Adam, "By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread," Genesis 3:19. Later verses add, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food and return to the ground. Genesis 3:17-19. This is the curse. This is the toil. This is the suffering that comes after you leave paradise. And the archaeological record confirms it, layer by layer, bone by bone, the physical evidence preserved in the skeletons of the first farmers. Farming is toil. Farming is sweat. Farming is the curse made literal, made real, made visible in the stress fractures of spines and the cavities in teeth, and the stunted growth of children born to agricultural peoples, made visible in the decline in height, in the increase in disease, in the shortened lifespan, made visible in every bone that shows the marks of labour. The text captured something true, something the people who wrote Genesis knew, because the knowledge had been preserved in oral tradition for millennia, passed down through generations. Your ancestors farmed. They knew the curse. They remembered a time before when it was different. They remembered when their bodies were stronger, when their lives were easier, when food was gathered rather than grown. So why did they do it? Why would humanity knowingly, willingly walk away from abundance and into slavery? Why would they trade leisure for labour, health for sickness, freedom for obligation? The answer lies in a climate catastrophe that struck at precisely the moment when farming was beginning, the Younger Dryas event. Around 10,800 BCE, the world suddenly got cold, dramatically, devastatingly cold. The Ice Age had officially ended 1,000 years before, around 11,700 BCE, in what we call the Holocene. But something triggered a sudden return to Ice Age conditions. It happened rapidly, possibly over just a few decades. Temperatures plummeted. It lasted for 1,200 years. The world was gripped by cold. This wasn't a gradual cooling that people could adapt to. This was a sudden, shocking shift, a reversal of the warming trend that people had begun to expect. Imagine the terror. Imagine warming for 1,000 years, watching the glaciers retreat, feeling the earth open up, green things growing, abundance increasing. And then suddenly, within decades, the world plunging back into Ice Age conditions. The temperatures dropped as much as 20 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions. Crops that were beginning to grow in the warming climate failed. The abundant wild plants that had sustained human populations for millennia, they couldn't grow. The climate was too cold. The growing seasons became shorter. Plants that had been reliable food sources began to fail or disappear from certain regions. The herds that people hunted began to disappear or migrate to new territories. Horses vanished from Europe. The megafauna, the woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths that had been part of the landscape, were already declining, and the climate change accelerated this decline. The abundance that characterizes the hunter-gatherer life, it vanished. People were starving. Starvation, desperation, fear. And in desperation, in the face of famine, they began to do something they'd never done before on any significant scale. They planted seeds intentionally. They started farming, not because it was better, not because they wanted to, not because it represented progress or innovation for its own sake, but because they had to. They had no choice. The old ways of living weren't working anymore. The world had changed, and humans had to change with it or perish. This is what Genesis describes, though it uses different language. It describes a change in the world that forced a change in how humans lived. The abundance went away. The serpent, the voice of knowledge, had offered consciousness and consequence, and humans were forced into toil, forced into the fields, forced into the labour that would define civilization. And the text captures something profoundly true about this transition. Once you eat from the tree of knowledge, you can't go back. Once you know agriculture is possible, you can't unknow it. Once the climate has shifted and made hunting and gathering impossible, the paradise of abundance is closed to you forever. You have eaten from the tree, and expulsion from paradise is inevitable. You have crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. And here's where it gets even more remarkable. Because the evidence for where the transition happened is so specific, so precise, that it points directly back to Göbekli Tepe. The wild ancestor of domesticated wheat is einkorn. Einkorn wheat grew naturally in the areas around the Fertile Crescent before farming. Archaeological and botanical evidence shows that einkorn was gathered by hunter-gatherers long before it was cultivated. But genetic analysis, careful, systematic genetic analysis of ancient wheat seeds recovered from archaeological sites has traced the origin of domesticated wheat, the wheat that became the staple of human civilization, to a very specific location. The Karakadag Mountains, in modern-day Turkey, just 20 miles from Göbekli Tepe. The same region, the same people, very likely, or at least the direct descendants of those people, the same moment in time. The genetic evidence is clear and undeniable. The domestic varieties of wheat that spread across the Fertile Crescent and eventually across the entire world originated in those mountains. The DNA of cultivated wheat points back to that place, that time, those people. Scientists have traced the genetic signatures, the markers that distinguish wild einkorn from domestic einkorn, and they all point back to the Karakadag region. This was where the first intentional planting happened. This was where humans first learned to select seeds, to save the largest seeds for planting, to create a new variety of wheat. This was where agriculture was born. This was ground zero for the transformation of human civilization. So what we're looking at is this. A community gathers for ceremony at Göbekli Tepe. They carve images of boars and lions and mysterious figures. They conduct rituals. They share sacred space. They participate in something that ties them to the divine, to the ancestors, to something larger than themselves. This is the peak of their civilization, the fullest expression of their spiritual and cultural life. And then, within generations, the younger Dryas strikes. The cold comes, the animals disappear, the plants wither, the abundance vanishes overnight, and the same people, or their descendants, turn to the hillsides of Karakadag and begin to plant wild einkorn wheat. They do it out of necessity, out of desperation, out of a need to survive in a world that has suddenly become hostile. But they don't know, they can't possibly know, that they're planting the seed of something far larger. They're planting the seed of civilization itself. They're planting agriculture. They're planting inequality. They're planting the entire trajectory of human history. And it all happens within a day's walk from Göbekli Tepe, within view of the sacred place, within the same landscape that had known the gathering of hunters at their temple. Within a generation, agriculture spreads from those mountains. Within a few centuries, farming becomes the dominant way of life across the Fertile Crescent. Within 1,000 years, cities rise. Within 2,000 years, you have written language, armies, kings, and all the structures of what we call civilization. All of this, all of it, flows from that moment when people began to plant seeds out of desperation. This is the fall from Eden written into archaeology. This is the expulsion from paradise. The story in Genesis, preserved in oral tradition for thousands of years, carried down through generations of storytellers, contains an astonishing truth. You lived in paradise. You lived in abundance. There was food freely available. There was time for rest, for ceremony, for play. And then something happened. The climate changed. The world became hostile. And you were driven out. You were forced to toil in the fields, forced to plant, forced to harvest, forced to labour. And that labour became the defining feature of human existence. The Genesis story is folk memory. It's the memory of that transition. It's a story preserved in the collective unconscious, passed down and down and down until it became scripture. And archaeology confirms it, not in every detail, not literally, but in the essential truth. Humanity really did live in a state of relative abundance and leisure. Humanity really was forced into agricultural labour. It really did happen in the region of the Fertile Crescent, near Göbekli Tepe. It really was triggered by a climate catastrophe, the Younger Dryas, and the genetic evidence really does point to the Karakadag Mountains, just miles away from the temple. The story is real, the history is real, the paradise was real, and the fall was real. It happened. It's written in our bones. It's written in the genetic code of the wheat we eat. It's written in the skeletons of the first farmers, their bodies bearing the marks of the curse that came after paradise was lost. The catastrophic transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer happened in stages across the Fertile Crescent, but the effects were immediate and devastating. Bodies weakened, lifespans shortened, disease increased, poverty emerged where there had been relative equality. But agriculture didn't just change how humans worked, it changed the structure of human society itself. And this is where we see the emergence of something entirely new: inequality, class, hierarchy, war. The hunter-gatherer societies that came before farming were, by and large, egalitarian. Anthropological evidence and the material culture, the tools, the art, the settlement patterns, all suggest that these societies had minimal class structure. There were certainly leaders, there were certainly people with more status, more prestige, but the basic level of inequality was low. Everyone had enough, everyone could survive, everyone had agency, everyone had a voice in their community. Farming changed this. Farming created surplus. For the first time, humans could produce more food than they immediately consumed. This surplus had to be stored, it had to be protected, and the storage, the protection of that surplus, created a new kind of power. Someone had to manage the granary. Someone had to decide how the surplus was distributed. Someone had to control it. And that control, that management, became the first expression of centralized authority, the first state, the first government, the first king, the first tyrant. The surplus also created wealth, and wealth, once it exists, is almost never distributed equally. Some people accumulated more, some people accumulated more and passed it to their children. Families began to form dynasties, clans began to form tribes, tribes began to form regions, and very quickly, within the span of a few centuries after farming took root, you have the emergence of cities. You have the emergence of temples controlled by priests who extract offerings from the farmers. You have the emergence of priesthoods. You have specialized roles, warriors, priests, administrators, merchants. You have classes. You have the rich and the poor. You have, for the first time in human history, slavery. The people who didn't own land, who didn't have access to the surplus, who had only their labor to sell, they became enslaved. They became property. Their children were born into slavery. Entire families were enslaved to work the fields. This is what farming built. This is the inevitable trajectory. Surplus creates wealth. Wealth creates inequality. Inequality creates class. Class creates hierarchy. Hierarchy creates oppression, war, conquest, slavery. All of this emerges from the decision to plant seeds instead of following animals. All of it is the direct consequence of that one shift, that one moment when climate forced humans into the fields. Within just a few hundred years of the beginning of agriculture, we see evidence of walls around settlements, walls built to protect against raids, against other communities coming to steal surplus. We see evidence of weapons. We see skeletal remains that show signs of violence. We see burials of people who show signs of having been executed or sacrificed. The peace of the hunter-gatherer world, the egalitarianism, the relative absence of organized violence, it evaporates as agriculture takes hold. The old world dies. The new world is born in blood and sweat and tears. The transition is brutal. The cost is counted in every generation that follows, in every skeleton that bears the marks of agricultural labor, in every shortened lifespan and stunted body. Yet civilization emerges. Cities rise. Writing develops. Art flourishes. Knowledge accumulates. We gain so much, but we lose something precious too. We lose the leisure. We lose the health. We lose the equality. This is the double-edged sword of human civilization, and this too is present in the Genesis story. Because paradise is not just characterized by abundance, it's characterized by equality. Adam and Eve walk naked in the garden. There's no shame. There's no hierarchy between them. They have equal access to the fruits of the earth. They're not enslaved to labor. They're not divided into classes. But after the expulsion, after they're forced to farm, the story takes on the language of shame, of separation, of hierarchy. Eve is subordinate. Cain and Abel have unequal offerings. One is favored, one is rejected. Cain kills Abel out of jealousy and rage. Within 3 generations of leaving paradise, you have murder, you have fratricide, you have the beginning of all the horrors that come from inequality and competition. This is not accident. This is not coincidence. This is a story, preserved through time, that captures the essential truth of what farming did to human society. It created hierarchy. It created inequality. It created the conditions for violence, for domination, for all the suffering that comes with class-based civilization. It created shame and division, and the sense that you must compete for scarce resources, must struggle to ensure that your children survive and prosper, must be willing to harm others to protect your own. This is the fallen state. This is the curse. This is what it means to be human after the eating of the forbidden fruit. This is the price we paid for leaving paradise. This is what we gained and what we lost when we became civilized. If you're still awake and enjoying this exploration of how history and scripture intersect, consider subscribing to the Calm Archive. A like really does help more people find these videos when they can't sleep. When you're searching for something that calms the mind and settles the body, your support means more than you know. Now let's get back to what happened after paradise was lost. Because the story becomes even more complex, even more mysterious, reaching back further into time than most people realize. The ancient texts are very specific about one thing, and this specificity is what kept scholars searching for Eden for millennia. Genesis doesn't just describe Eden as a garden somewhere in the vague spiritual realm, it describes it with geography, real geography, 4 rivers, Tigris, Euphrates, Pishon, and Gihon. The first 2 we recognize immediately on any map of the Middle East. They flow through Iraq and Syria today, just as they did 10,000 years ago. But the second pair, Pishon and Gihon, disappeared from maps so long ago that most scholars assumed they were mythical, imaginary, proof that the Eden story was pure legend. But in the 1990s, something changed. Geologists and archaeologists began using satellite radar to peer through the sand of the Arabian Peninsula, and what they found was remarkable. Beneath the dunes of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, they discovered ancient riverbeds, massive channels carved into the bedrock, systems so large they must have once carried enormous volumes of water. One of these buried rivers, the Kuwait River, matches the description of Pishon so precisely that geologist Farouk El-Baz, who discovered it through satellite imagery, proposed it as the answer to a question that had puzzled scholars for 2,000 years. Where was Pishon? It wasn't imaginary, it was just buried, covered by millennia of sand blown across the desert. The imaging technology allowed scientists to see through the sand to the bedrock beneath, revealing the ancient course of a river that had flowed for millennia and then gone dry. The river had deposited sediment, had shaped the landscape, had been central to life in that region. And then, as the climate changed, as water sources shifted, the river dried up. Its course was preserved in the rock, visible now only through satellite imaging. The river that had been so important to the Genesis writer, so vivid in their memory, or in the memories passed down to them, was restored to visibility through technology the ancient writers could never have imagined. The discovery was stunning. The ancient river system connected to the Persian Gulf exactly as the text described. The text was right. The river existed. It had been real. The Gihon is equally fascinating, though it's harder to trace because the region has undergone more dramatic geological change over time. Some scholars argue the Gihon was the Karun River, which flows through Iran today, emerging from the Zagros Mountains and flowing into the Persian Gulf. The Karun is the most significant river in Iran, and it flows through a region of remarkable natural wealth and abundance. The word Gihon itself means to burst forth with force, and the Karun does exactly that, bursting from the mountains with tremendous power. Others suggest it was a massive tributary, flowing down from the Zagros Mountains, now completely dry, leaving only faint traces in satellite imagery and ancient texts. The evidence points to a more complex hydrology in the ancient past, with more rivers, more water, more abundance. The geological record shows that during certain periods, particularly around the end of the Ice Age and into the early Holocene, the Persian Gulf region had more rainfall and more water flowing through it. The rivers were larger, more consistent, more life-giving. This would have made the region even more fertile, even more paradise-like for the people who lived there. The channels in the rock, the evidence of ancient water flows, the traces of extinct or diverted rivers, all of this speaks to a world that was different from the world today, a world with more water, a world with more abundance, a world that deserved to be called paradise, a world where 4 rivers converged to bring life and fertility to all the lands they touched. But here's where it becomes compelling. When you take all 4 rivers, Tigris, Euphrates, Pishon, and Gihon, and you map them to their real-world locations, they converge. Not in a vague sense, but specifically. They all flow toward or originate from a single region. The headwaters cluster in southeastern Turkey. The rivers merge toward the Persian Gulf basin, and the basin itself is the most fertile, most life-giving region of the ancient world. The Fertile Crescent, the exact place where agriculture was invented, the exact place where civilization began, the exact place where the four rivers of Genesis converge. This isn't coincidence. This is geography matching text. This is archaeology matching scripture. And when you stand back and look at this convergence, you see something that seems almost impossible. The four rivers of Eden, described in a text written thousands of years ago, point directly to the birthplace of human civilization, to the place where people stopped hunting and gathering, where they settled, where they learned to farm, where the first cities rose, where paradise, as the ancient world knew it, ended. The text captures it perfectly. The Lord God planted a garden in the east, in Eden. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there it was separated into four headwaters. The name of the first is the Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east side of Ashur, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. The text is remarkably specific about the location, the rivers, the geography. The description of the geography is accurate. The place existed. The rivers flowed. The waters brought life. Someone knew this place. Someone remembered this place. The knowledge of these rivers, these locations, these four streams coming together in abundance. It was preserved. It was precious enough to pass down. It was true enough to survive thousands of years in memory. But there's another layer to this geography, one that changes everything, one that transforms the story from poetry into history, one that makes the ancient text speak directly to geological and archaeological reality. The Persian Gulf as it exists today wasn't always water. During the last ice age, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower, the Persian Gulf was dry land, a vast plain, one of the most fertile regions on Earth. Imagine it. Not a gulf, not a body of salt water, but a fertile valley stretching for hundreds of miles, a wide river-valley ecosystem, rivers flowing through it, grasses, plants, animals gathering around those water sources. The climate in that region would have been cooler and wetter than it is today, with more reliable rainfall, more clouds, more rain, more water flowing from the mountains, communities thriving there because food was abundant, because the climate was stable, because water was available, because paradise, in practical terms, existed. The bones of animals found in the sediments of the Persian Gulf show that lions, leopards, and other big cats roamed there. Deer and wild boar were present in abundance. Fish from the rivers provided protein. The climate would have supported wild grains and legumes, honey from wild bees, fruit from wild trees. A human community living in this region would have experienced abundance, would have had security, would have known a way of life very different from the harsh desert we see today. This would have been a place where a small population could easily find food, where water was abundant, where life was relatively easy, where paradise made sense, where paradise was real, where the story of Eden would have made complete sense to the people who lived there. Around 12,000 years ago, at the very end of the last ice age, the temperatures rose. The ice sheets that covered much of the northern hemisphere began to melt. The meltwater flowed into the oceans. The sea levels rose relentlessly, foot by foot, year by year, century by century. The waters crept inland. Imagine living in that fertile plain and watching the water level rise. At first it's subtle. You notice the rivers are fuller, the marshes are bigger, but the abundance seems to continue. Then, over generations, it becomes more apparent. The low-lying areas are beginning to flood permanently. You have to move your settlements higher. The rivers don't flow the way they used to. The landscape is changing. Imagine this process happening over hundreds of years, affecting generations of people. Your children born into a world that's slowly becoming different. Your parents remember a time when the land extended further, when the rivers flowed differently. Your grandparents remember the Great Plain. Your great-grandparents remember when the waters were just beginning to come. The loss is recorded in memory, generation by generation. The people living in the Persian Gulf basin watched their world transform. The Great Plain they called home began to flood. The waters rose until the entire Gulf became what it is today, a sea, a body of salt water. The freshwater rivers that had flowed through the fertile plain now flowed into a gulf of salt water. The grasslands disappeared beneath the waves. The animal populations migrated or perished. The climate became hotter and drier. The region transformed from a paradise of abundance to a harsh desert with oasis settlements struggling against scarcity. Those communities fled. They moved inland to higher ground, to the river valleys of Mesopotamia, to the slopes of the Zagros Mountains, to the regions where water was still reliably available. They carried their memories with them, the memory of a place where life was easier, where abundance flowed like water, where the world hadn't yet demanded that humans labour to survive, where you could gather food without struggle, where animals were abundant, where the rivers ran clear and full, where 4 rivers came together to bring life. They passed these memories down, generation to generation. The story evolved, shaped by culture, shaped by theology, shaped by the human need to explain how paradise was lost, shaped by the need to process trauma, to understand sudden change, to make sense of displacement and loss. Deep within the story, beneath all the layers of cultural adaptation and theological interpretation, but at its core remained a truth, a historical memory of a real place that really existed, a real flooding event that displaced real people. And the story, told and retold for 10,000 years, eventually became the Garden of Eden, eventually was written into scripture, eventually became one of the most influential stories in human history. The genetic evidence supports this, not metaphorically, but scientifically. Mitochondrial DNA studies have traced the origin of agriculture and the first farmers to this region. The genetic footprints of the first farmers, the people who stayed in the Fertile Crescent after the floods, show they descended from populations that lived in the Persian Gulf basin. The genetics match the geography. The timeline matches the flood. The migrations that we can trace through DNA analysis show populations moving from the Gulf region up into Mesopotamia, into the river valleys, into the highland regions. These people carried not just their genes, but their culture, their language, their stories with them. The mitochondrial DNA signatures are distinctive. They point back to a source population in the Persian Gulf region. Somewhere around 8,000 to 6,000 years before the Common Era, agriculture emerged here. Not elsewhere first. Here, in the region where Eden is described, where the 4 rivers converged, where a great flood displaced people who then became the ancestors of the first farmers. The probability of all this being coincidence approaches 0. The odds are impossibly small. The convergence of evidence is undeniable. The text knew, the text remembered. The probability that an ancient author, without modern geological knowledge, happened to place the Garden of Eden in a location that matches all the evidence, geographical, archaeological and genetic, is vanishingly small. The more we examine the evidence, the more we see that the Genesis account, while written thousands of years after the events it describes, contains memories that reach back to real events, real places, real human experiences preserved in story and transmitted through oral tradition. The text knew something. The text remembered something. The text was preserving something true. And then there's the question of the tree of knowledge. For centuries, scholars treated this as purely allegorical, a symbol of forbidden wisdom, a metaphor for the human condition. But what if it represented something more literal? What if it was a metaphor rooted in a specific change in human consciousness and human practice? Consider what the tree represented. The fruit granted knowledge. It separated humans from innocence. It made them aware of good and evil, of consequence, of mortality. It opened their eyes to the complexity of existence. In psychological terms, it represented the movement from instinctual living to conscious planning, from an animal existence governed by immediate needs and animal drives to a human existence governed by foresight and strategy. Before the tree, Eden's inhabitants didn't farm. They didn't plan ahead for months or years. They didn't labour, they gathered and hunted. The land provided. When you needed food, you found it. When you needed water, you followed the rivers. Life was present tense, reactive, animal-like in its simplicity, not thoughtless but immediate, not planned but responsive to immediate circumstances. Then came agriculture. The tree of knowledge became the knowledge of how to plant seeds, how to predict seasons, how to prepare soil, how to store grain for winter, how to build surpluses, how to plan not just for today but for next month, next season, next year, how to organize labour, how to manage populations, how to preserve food, how to construct buildings. Knowledge proliferated, and in gaining this knowledge, something was lost. The paradise of natural abundance became the necessity of labour. Easy living became hard work. Freedom became obligation. The ability to move became the need to stay in one place and tend crops. The story of the fall is, in this reading, the story of becoming human, gaining the gift of foresight and planning, but losing the gift of living without worry, trading paradise for consciousness, trading abundance for achievement, trading freedom for complexity. And the text captures something deeply true about this transition. You can't go backward. Once you know, you can't unknow. Once you farm, you can't return to gathering. Once you've learned the secrets of agriculture, paradise is closed to you. You've eaten from the tree and there's no going back. Your children will be born into agricultural society. They won't remember the old ways. The knowledge will persist, but the innocence is gone forever. And this is why the tree is both blessing and curse. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is freedom. Knowledge is also burden. Knowledge is responsibility. Knowledge is the end of innocence. The serpent too has been misunderstood by Western theology and interpretation. Western Christianity made the serpent into evil, into sin incarnate, into the devil himself. But in the ancient Near Eastern world, serpents meant something different. They represented wisdom, transformation, the earth itself, fertility and renewal. In Mesopotamian texts, the serpent is a teacher, a transformer, a figure of knowledge and regeneration. In Egyptian mythology, the serpent is the uraeus, a symbol of divine power and protection. When Genesis describes the serpent as more cunning than any creature of the field, the original language implies not malice but intelligence. The word for cunning can also mean wise, astute, clever. The serpent isn't deceiving in the sense of lying, it's offering genuine knowledge, true knowledge. The serpent tells the woman that eating the fruit will make her like God, knowing good and evil, and the text doesn't contradict this. It's true. Eating the fruit does grant knowledge. The eyes of both the man and woman are opened. They know good and evil. The serpent isn't deceptive, it's honest. And that honesty, that clarity about what the fruit offers and what it costs, is precisely what makes the choice so profound. The serpent is the voice of transformation, the agent of change, the facilitator of the transition from one state of being to another. In ancient wisdom traditions, this is what serpents do. They shed their skins, they transform, they represent rebirth and the cycles of the earth. The serpent in Eden isn't evil, it's honest. It's showing humanity the path to consciousness, knowing that consciousness comes with a cost. It's the voice of the natural world offering knowledge. It's the force of change, inevitable and relentless. The serpent, in this reading, is not the enemy. It's the mirror. It's showing humanity what humanity has the potential to become. It's wisdom speaking in the garden. It's the necessary catalyst for the change that must happen. Imagine yourself standing in the landscape where this story begins. Picture southeastern Turkey in the late afternoon. The sun is descending toward the horizon, casting everything in amber light. The rolling hills stretch before you, covered in the grasses of the steppe. In the distance, you can see the source waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, flowing from the mountains toward their distant journey through Mesopotamia. You can see the landscape that shaped human consciousness, that drew the first farmers, that witnessed the birth of civilization. Here, in this place, at this exact convergence of geography and history, the Fertile Crescent begins. You're standing where the first farmers stood, where the first cities would rise, where the first writers would record their memories of the world before, the world that was lost. The stones are ancient. Göbekli Tepe, 15 miles away, has witnessed 11,000 years of human history. Its structures catch the last light of day, the carved animals on the pillars seeming to come alive in the shifting shadows. Around you, you can almost hear the voices of the people who lived here, the communities that knew abundance, the people who watched the waters rise and had to flee, the descendants who remembered, generation after generation, that once there was a place where paradise existed. The wind carries the memory. The landscape itself seems to hold it. The hills remember. The rivers remember. The very earth is a book written in the language of stone and water and time. This is where it happened. This is where the story began. Not in mythology, not in theology, but in history, in the real movements of peoples and waters and time, the climate changes that reshaped a world, the flooding that displaced communities, the emergence of agriculture that changed what it meant to be human, the songs that were sung around fires to make sense of it all, the memories that were precious enough to carry across generations, across languages, across centuries, until they were written down and became scripture. This is where Eden was, not somewhere else. Here, in this place, in this geography, in this history, in these rivers, in this flood, in the memory of abundance and the reality of loss. The answer lies in the power of story to transform history into meaning. Stories encode knowledge. Stories preserve memory. Stories make sense of trauma. The answer lies in the human capacity to find universal truth in particular events, the capacity to take what happened to one people and make it speak to all people. These are deep, profound questions that have occupied philosophers and historians for centuries, and yet this raises the final question that will occupy us as we move deeper into the night. If Eden is a memory, if it's rooted in historical events that occurred 10,000 years ago, how did that memory survive? How did the story of the Persian Gulf flood, the displacement of communities, the transition from gathering to agriculture, become transformed into one of the world's most powerful myths? How did a geographical and historical event become a theological and philosophical statement about the nature of human consciousness and our place in the universe? How did a story that started as an oral tradition in Mesopotamia, passed down from grandparent to grandchild, whispered around fires in mud brick houses, become transformed into something that speaks to us today with such power and resonance? How did it become more true in its metaphorical form than it ever could have been in its literal form? How did the memory not just survive but transform? How did it become universal? How did a specific place and a specific flood become a story about the human condition itself? The answer lies in the power of story to transform history into meaning. The answer lies in the human capacity to find universal truth in particular events. The answer to that question, the story of how a memory becomes a myth, how history becomes theology, how the personal becomes universal, how one place and one flood become a message that speaks across 10,000 years and across all human cultures, is what we'll explore next as we continue our journey into the depths of the Calm Archive. Now, you might be wondering how a story survives. How does a memory of a place, a garden, persist for thousands of years without written records? How does a historical event become a myth that travels across cultures and centuries? The answer lies in something so fundamental to human nature that we often take it for granted: the power of the spoken word and the remarkable capacity of human memory to preserve truth across generations. Before writing existed, before the invention of cuneiform in ancient Sumer around 3200 BCE, all human knowledge was transmitted through oral tradition. Every story, every piece of wisdom, every historical account lived in the minds and voices of people. Mothers told children. Children became adults and told their own children. Around a fire in the darkness, the same stories were spoken again and again, generation after generation for thousands of years. In cultures that relied entirely on oral transmission, specialized memory keepers emerged: bards, griots, shamans, who devoted their lives to memorizing and accurately recounting the stories of their people. These weren't casual tellings. They were formal performances governed by strict rules about the preservation of key details, about the order of events, about the exact words and phrases that carried meaning. The human mind, when trained, and when motivated by the cultural importance of the story, can retain remarkable amounts of detailed information across multiple tellings. Studies of modern oral traditions show that key narratives can be preserved with surprising accuracy over centuries. The rhythm and meter of oral poetry, the use of repetition and formulaic language served as memory devices. Important details were embedded in phrases that were easy to remember and to pass along. The story itself became the vessel for truth. Scientists once thought oral transmission was impossible. They assumed oral traditions were unreliable, corrupted by time, distorted by countless retellings. But then came a fascinating discovery that changed everything. Aboriginal Australians have maintained continuous oral traditions for over 50,000 years. Some scholars suggest even longer, perhaps 60,000 years or more. These traditions include dreamtime stories that encode detailed geographical and natural knowledge. And when geologists examined these stories carefully, they found something remarkable. These accounts contain precise descriptions of sea level changes and coastal geography from a time when Australia's coastline looked completely different. These memories were accurate. The flood narratives, The descriptions of submerged lands that are now underwater, the stories of animal behavior and climate patterns, all of it matched what geologists knew about post-glacial sea level rise that occurred roughly 12,000 years ago. These accounts describe valleys and ridges that are now underwater, features that were visible before the sea level rose. The shapes of the ancient coastlines described in the stories matched the evidence from geological surveys and bathymetric maps. The details were specific. The timing was accurate. A story that was over 12,000 years old, preserved entirely in oral form, in song and narrative and ritual performance, retained accurate information about geological events. A story, it turns out, can be a vessel for truth that spans 10,000 years or more. The specificity of the Aboriginal narrative suggests that they weren't vague myths, but careful encodings of observed reality, transmitted as sacred knowledge to be preserved and protected and passed down with fidelity. If a story can preserve geographical knowledge for 12,000 years, it can certainly preserve the essential narrative of a flood and a fall for 10,000 years. So when we consider the story of Eden, we must ask, how long might such a narrative have survived in oral tradition before being written down? The evidence suggests a very long time indeed. The story that would become the Book of Genesis was likely told and retold for thousands of years, perhaps as long as 3,000 or 4,000 years, before it was finally written down by Hebrew scholars around 600 to 500 BCE. Imagine that. A story beginning in the aftermath of the last ice age, around 10,000 years ago, passed through countless lips, travelling through countless minds, surviving the rise and fall of empires long before anyone thought to preserve it in writing. The story would have travelled with traders and travellers, would have been adapted to different cultures and contexts, would have been told in different languages, yet somewhere in its core would have remained the essential narrative. The description of the garden, the location in the east, the rivers, the sense that something was lost, the knowledge that humans once lived differently, the memory that the world had changed. This is a testament to the power of story, to the way narrative can preserve memory, to the way essential truth can survive transmission across countless generations. For 4,000 years, this story lived in the minds of people before it was written. 4,000 years of mothers telling children. 4,000 years of elders recounting the ancient times. 4,000 years of ritual retelling that encoded the story in memory and culture. Then, when writing was finally invented, the story was recorded. It was preserved in the form we know today. And yet the story of Eden was not unique to the Hebrew tradition. The people of ancient Sumer, who lived in the very region where the Euphrates and Tigris flowed, who inhabited the same land where this paradise might have existed, had their own version of this ancient memory. They called it Dilmun. The Sumerians were among the first people to develop writing, and among the first things they wrote about were their ancient myths and religious traditions. The oldest written accounts of Dilmun appear on clay tablets, dating to around 1800 BCE, preserved in cuneiform inscriptions in the great libraries of ancient cities. In Sumerian mythology, Dilmun was described as a clean, bright, pure land of sunshine. It was a place where there was no sickness, no pain, no death. The sun always shone. The climate was perfect. No violence existed. No tears were shed. No one suffered. The animals lived in peace with one another. Predators and prey existed together without conflict. Food grew abundantly without labour. The sun always shone, and the land was eternally fertile. There was no need for fear or struggle. There was no need to farm, no need to work. Life simply flowed easily. It is, in every sense, a description of paradise. A description that matches the Genesis account almost perfectly. A description of a place where humans lived without toil, without suffering, without the burden of labour that characterises the agricultural societies that emerged from this region. And the remarkable thing is this. The oldest written account of Dilmun predates the written account of Eden by over 1,000 years. The Sumerians were writing about this mythical golden land when the Hebrew traditions were still purely oral, passed down from generation to generation as sacred memory. Yet they lived in the same region. They remembered the same loss. They preserved in their myths the memory of a time before agriculture, a time before cities, a time when life was different. The Sumerian memory and the Hebrew memory converge on the same basic narrative, a place of abundance, a transition to hardship, something lost, something yearned for. The story travelled, as stories do, From Sumer to Babylon to the Hebrew kingdoms, from one language to another, from one culture to another. And with each telling, across each culture, the core remained. A time of abundance, a place of peace, something that was lost, a knowledge that humans had once lived in a state that was fundamentally different from their current existence. The story became universal because it was rooted in a universal truth. This pattern repeats again in another ancient Sumerian text, one of the oldest written narratives in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Within this grand narrative about a king's search for immortality, about his quest to escape death itself, there is an embedded story, a flood story, a catastrophic deluge that destroys the world from which only a single righteous man and his family escape. They build a boat, they gather the animals, they sail through the waters of destruction, and when the flood subsides, they emerge to repopulate the earth. The story of the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh predates the written account of Noah's flood in the Hebrew Bible by approximately 1,000 years. Yet the two narratives are nearly identical in structure and detail. The flood is announced, the righteous man is chosen, a vessel is built, the animals are gathered in pairs, the waters rise and inundate the earth, the vessel comes to rest on a mountain, birds are sent out to scout for dry land, the survivors emerge to begin again. The story of the flood travelled the same path as the paradise myth, from Sumer to Babylon to the Hebrew tradition, where it became the story of Noah, where it became part of Genesis. And through each retelling, across each culture, the story retained its essence: a deluge, a survivor, a second chance, a memory, preserved in different languages and cultures, of actual climate catastrophe. The Younger Dryas Cold Period, which brought sudden climate change around 12,800 years ago, the floods that followed when the climate began to warm and the ice sheets melted, the rising waters that drove populations from low-lying regions up into the river valleys and highlands. These weren't vague disasters. They were specific, measurable, catastrophic climate events that displaced populations and forced radical adaptations in how humans lived and organized themselves. The stories about these events were so important, so meaningful, that they were preserved. They were told and retold until they became sacred narratives. They were written down when writing was invented. They were carried across cultures and centuries because they contained truth that people needed to remember. They were told because they had been survived, and the survival had left marks that needed to be honoured. These are not coincidences. These are echoes. Echoes of a real event, a real place, a real transformation in human existence, travelling through time on the wings of human memory. Different cultures, living in the same region, or in regions that had been connected through trade and migration, remembered the same stories because they had experienced or inherited memories of the same events. The memories had crystallized around core narratives that made sense of profound change. The old world and the new world, paradise lost and the difficult present, the memory of abundance and the reality of labour, the shared experience of humanity being transformed from one state of being into another. But perhaps this is where we pause and consider something larger, something that reaches beyond any single culture or region, something that suggests we're not just talking about one specific place or one specific flood. Nearly every ancient civilization, every culture that recorded its mythology and prehistory, preserved a memory of a golden age, a time when life was easier, when food was abundant, when humans lived in harmony with nature and with themselves. From all corners of the world, from disconnected cultures, comes this same narrative. The ancient Greeks spoke of the golden age of Kronos, described in the poet Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days. It was a time of peace, when harvest came without labour, when conflict was unknown, when mortals lived in innocence and plenty. The earth produced food spontaneously. No one had to work, no one suffered. The gods themselves lived among humans, and there was harmony between the divine and the mortal realms. The Hindu traditions speak of the Satya Yuga, the age of truth or age of purity, when Dharma was perfect, when virtue was effortless, when the earth was abundant, when humans lived for thousands of years in health and harmony. In this age there was no disease, no suffering, no death. Righteousness prevailed without effort. The cycles of nature worked perfectly. In the Norse traditions there are memories of Asgard before the first battle, and of Midgard in an age before warfare and suffering became the norm. A time when the world was perfect, ordered, peaceful, before the conflicts and ruptures that characterize the current age. The Norse concept of Ragnarok, the end of the world, is paired with these memories of a more perfect beginning. The Taoists in ancient China described a golden age when humans lived spontaneously with nature, when they lived without force or constraint, when they moved with the natural rhythms of the Tao, when humans were in complete harmony with the way of things. The Aztecs remembered Chipactli, the first paradise, a place of abundance and ease. The Mayans spoke of an age before time, an age of perfection that preceded the current creation, an age when humans lived in perfect order and harmony, in African traditions, in Aboriginal Australian traditions, in the traditions of indigenous peoples from Polynesia to the Amazon to North America. The same memory appears, a golden age, a time of abundance, a harmony that was lost. From Hawaii to New Zealand to the indigenous peoples of North America, similar stories are told, a time of peace, a fall, a knowledge that something has been lost. From culture to culture, continent to continent, the same story echoes, a paradise lost, an abundance taken away, a harmony that once existed but exists no more, a time before struggle, before labour, before the hard choices of civilization. Why would so many unconnected peoples remember the same thing? Why would this narrative be so universal, so consistent in its themes, so deeply embedded in human consciousness across cultures that had no direct contact with one another? Why would people separated by continents and centuries all remember a golden age? Why would this narrative pattern appear again and again? The answer might not require us to point to a single location on a map. Perhaps instead we're looking at the memory of a universal human experience, not the loss of one specific garden in one specific place, but the loss of an entire way of life. The transition from the abundance of the hunter-gatherer world to the scarcity and labour of the agricultural world. This transition didn't happen everywhere at the same time. Agriculture emerged independently in different regions around the world, in the Fertile Crescent, in China, in Mesoamerica, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Papua New Guinea. But wherever and whenever it happened, it represented a fundamental break with the past, a change in how humans lived, a loss of something and a gain of something else. For nearly 300,000 years, humans lived as hunters and gatherers. We moved with the seasons, we followed the animals, we gathered fruits and nuts and roots as nature provided them. The archaeological evidence suggests that these people worked far less than agricultural peoples. They had more leisure time, they experienced fewer infectious diseases, they lived closer to nature, more in tune with the cycles of the earth. Food, while sometimes scarce in specific seasons or regions, was generally sufficient. There was no hierarchy, no kings, no slavery, no conquest. There were no tax collectors or priests demanding offerings. There were no armies, no wars of conquest. There was, in many ways, a kind of natural abundance and freedom. Then, roughly 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended and the climate stabilized, humans began to farm, and everything changed. Farming required constant labor. It created surpluses, which created storage, which created property, which created inequality. It created density of population, which created disease. It created hierarchy, because someone had to manage the surplus and organize the labor. It created the state because large groups of people needed to be coordinated and organized. It created warfare, because now there were valuable crops worth fighting for. Armies emerged to defend territory and resources. It created gods that demanded offerings because people needed to understand why the rains failed and the harvest died. It created writing because it became necessary to keep records of the surplus. It created all the complexity of civilization and all the suffering that comes with it. It also created art, science, philosophy, music, and everything we think of as culture. But at the foundation was labour, constant grinding labour. That's the price of civilization. That's the curse. The transition from abundance to scarcity, from leisure to labour, from harmony to hierarchy, from nature to civilization. This was the most fundamental transformation in human history, and nearly every culture remembers it. They called it the loss of the Golden Age, the closing of the gates of Eden, the fall from paradise, the end of the age of purity, the emergence of suffering. The stories preserved it because their ancestors had lived through it. Because it was a change significant enough to be worth remembering, because something precious had been lost and the loss needed to be honoured and acknowledged. The story told and retold for millennia, preserved in oral tradition, carried forward through language and song and ritual, was perhaps humanity's way of processing this enormous change. A cultural memory of what we lost when we gained the world. A way to preserve the knowledge of what had come before. A way to honour what had been sacrificed. A way to say, this is how we lived once. This is what was taken from us. This is worth remembering. But there is one more piece to this puzzle, one final image that ties everything together. And it brings us back to Göbekli Tepe, the sacred sanctuary on the hilltop in what is now Turkey, built around 9,500 BCE by people who had not yet settled into agriculture. This was the place where humans came to gather for the sacred. This was where ritual happened. This was where the last moments of the hunter-gatherer world were honoured. Here is the haunting detail. The people who built Göbekli Tepe deliberately buried it. Around 8,000 BCE, roughly 500 years after its initial construction began, they sealed it. They filled in the structures. They covered it with earth and stone. They buried their most sacred place. They closed the gates. They hid the garden. They sealed away their memory of what was. This wasn't natural decay. This wasn't the site being abandoned to ruin. This was a deliberate act, a ritual act, a conscious decision to hide away what had been so precious. Why would they do this? What moved them to seal away their most sacred space? Perhaps they understood that the world was changing. Perhaps they knew that the time of the hunter-gatherer was ending. Perhaps they chose to bury the temple to preserve it, to keep it pure, to make sure it wouldn't be profaned by the new agricultural societies emerging around them. Perhaps it was an act of mourning, a funeral for a way of life. For 9,500 years it remained hidden. No one knew it was there. The hilltop was empty, silent, forgotten. The site had become a secret, a memory preserved in stone and earth. And then, in the year 2000, archaeologists began to excavate, and slowly, carefully, they uncovered the structures beneath the earth. They found the T-shaped pillars, they found the carved animals, they found the place where community had gathered. They brought it back into the light, they restored it to memory. The world was finally ready to remember. Was this burial intentional? Was it a ritual closure? Was it a deliberate sealing away? A moment when the people who built this temple decided that the age it represented was over, and they chose to bury it, to preserve it in memory only, to let it rest in the earth. We may never know with certainty. But the image is profound, a sacred place, deliberately hidden, a garden of the mind sealed away, a memory preserved in stone and earth, waiting for thousands of years until the world was ready to remember. And now, as you lie here in the darkness listening to these words, you are remembering it too. You are part of a chain of memory that stretches back 10,000 years, from the time when humans gathered at a sacred place, when the world was different, when everything was about to change. The story was told, it travelled, it was preserved, it was written down. And now, in this moment, in this quietness, you're receiving it, just as your ancestors did, just as humans have done for 10,000 years. If the Calm Archive has become part of your bedtime routine, I'd love it if you shared this video with someone who might need it tonight, and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Now, where were we? We have journeyed through the geography of paradise. We have traced the rivers to their source. We have found the flood in the layers of the earth. We have discovered the story of the garden preserved in the minds and voices of countless generations. We have seen how one story, remembered across cultures and centuries, became one of the most powerful myths in human history. We have travelled back 10,000 years to Göbekli Tepe, to the moment when humans chose to gather in sacred space, and to the mystery of why they chose to bury it. And now, as we approach the final moments of this journey, we have come to understand something profound. The stories we tell about the past aren't just history. They're memories. They're wisdom. They're the voices of our ancestors speaking across time, trying to tell us something we need to hear. They're the echo of paradise, preserved in language and myth, waiting for us to listen. And so we come to the final resting place of our story. The quiet moment before sleep takes us fully under its gentle wing. Everything we have discussed, everything we have wandered through together across time and geography and the landscape of human memory, brings us here to this question. What does it truly mean if Eden was real, and was, not as a literal garden where perfect fruit hung from perfect branches and serpents spoke in human languages, not as a place where divine hands directly sculpted the landscape and commanded the animals, but as something far more profound and far more true, as an actual place where human beings lived in ecological balance, where the world provided and humans took only what they needed, where the relationship between person and earth was one of reciprocal belonging rather than extraction and dominion. It means that the Genesis story, stripped of its supernatural elements, becomes not less powerful but infinitely more so. It becomes a genuine human memory. It becomes an echo from 12,000 years ago of something that was actually lost, something that our ancestors actually experienced, something that shaped the deepest longings of every civilization that followed. The story is more powerful because it is true. Not true in the literal sense, but true in the way that the deepest truths always are. True in the sense that it captures something essential about the human condition, something real about our past and our longing. Think about this for a moment as you settle deeper into your pillow, as the weight of your body releases more fully into the mattress beneath you, as your breathing begins to slow and deepen without any conscious effort on your part. Every major culture on Earth, separated by thousands of miles of ocean and mountain and desert, remembers a golden age. The Greeks spoke of Cronus's reign, when gods and mortals lived together in harmony, and the earth gave forth her bounty without labour. The Hindus describe the Satya Yuga, the age of truth, when Dharma was complete and humans lived in perfect virtue. The Chinese remember a time of sage kings who ruled through moral example alone, needing no laws or punishments because society was ordered by virtue and cosmic harmony. The Mesopotamians had tales of a time before the Great Flood, when the world was young and the natural order was undisturbed and humans had not yet earned the divine ire. The Norse spoke of Asgard and the first golden age before the decay and corruption that would culminate in Ragnarok. Indigenous peoples around the world, from the Aboriginal Australians to the Native Americans to the peoples of Africa and the Pacific, carry narratives of a time of wholeness, a time before the Great Separation, a time when the divisions we now experience between sacred and secular, between human and animal, between self and other, did not yet exist. They remember it. They carry the memory. Is it possible that these are not merely myths, not merely spiritual metaphors created by priests and shamans to explain the inexplicable, but collective memories? Is it possible that somewhere in the depths of our genetic inheritance, somewhere in the structure of our cells and the architecture of our brains, we carry a memory of what life was like before the agricultural revolution fundamentally altered the human condition? Maybe we all do carry this, carried deep within us like a lullaby heard in infancy, and forgotten in waking life but never truly gone. A memory of simplicity, a memory of belonging, a memory of a time when food grew wild around you, and you moved with the seasons and the herds and the ripening of plants, when you were not separate from nature but woven into its endless rhythms, when rest came naturally because it was part of the dance of day and night, activity and recuperation, hunger and plenty. In that way of life, sleep was not something to be pushed off until all tasks were complete, not something scheduled and rationed and guilty. Sleep was simply part of the rhythm, like waking, like eating, like the turning of the day. You slept when the sun set because there was no reason to be awake in the darkness, and the darkness was complete in a way that no darkness exists anymore. Your ancestors did not have to fight against artificial light to fall asleep. They did not lie in bed racing with their thoughts. They did not wonder if they were sleeping enough or the right way. They simply rested when the time came, as naturally as a bird settles into its nest, as naturally as a river flows downhill, as naturally as the sun disappears below the horizon and the stars emerge. The garden is gone now, of course. We cannot go back to it, and perhaps it would be foolish to want to in every way. The agricultural revolution brought with it not only the complexities and pressures and anxieties that haunt modern life, but also mathematics and music and architecture and art and medicine and philosophy, and the accumulated knowledge that allows us to understand where we came from and why we long for what we have lost. We have built civilizations of extraordinary complexity and beauty on the foundation of that agricultural shift. We have created universities and hospitals and libraries and theatres and museums where the achievements of human genius are collected and preserved. We have learned to split the atom and map the genome and send machines to explore other planets, and relay images back across the vast emptiness of space. We have composed symphonies that move us to tears and written poetry that captures the essence of human experience and created paintings that stop us in our tracks with their beauty. We have done miraculous things. And alongside all of this, we have also created pressures and anxieties and disconnections from the natural world that our bodies were not designed to endure for such sustained periods. But this does not mean we should despise the modern world. It means we should understand ourselves with compassion. It means we should acknowledge both what we have gained and what we have lost, and honour both. Göbekli Tepe remains. The temple remains. Visitors can walk among those ancient stones even today, can place their hands on the same limestone pillars that were carved and shaped by human hands in an age that seems impossibly distant, and yet is merely the blink of an eye in the vast span of human existence. The T-shaped monoliths still stand, reaching upward into the Turkish sky just as they have for 12,000 years, through uncounted seasons of rain and sun and wind and snow. The carvings are still sharp. The details of those predatory birds and wild boars and foxes and snakes are still visible, still clear, still communicating something urgent and important across the gulf of millennia. Someone carved those stone heads with care. Someone spent hours, perhaps days, working the stone to capture the shape of a fox's snout or the curve of a bird's wing. Someone decided that this mattered enough to chisel and shape stone by stone to create something permanent, something that would outlast them and their children and their children's children. Someone wanted to leave a message for the future, wanted to create something that would speak to people who would never know their name, who would never hear their voice, who would come from a world so different and distant that it would be impossible for them to fully imagine it, and it has endured. Through earthquakes and erosion and the rise and fall of empires and the complete transformation of human civilization, through floods and droughts, and the arrival of new peoples and the departure of old ones, those stones have endured. They still speak. They still communicate. They still tell us that meaning was created there, that beauty was carved there, that transcendence was pursued there. Modern Turkey surrounds Göbekli Tepe now. The landscape has changed considerably. Cities have grown where once there were only villages and encampments, and temporary shelters made from branch and hide. Roads cross where once there were only paths worn by the feet of animals and hunters who walked the same routes season after season, generation after generation. Olive groves and wheat fields have replaced the wild grasslands and the sparse forests of pine and oak. Dams have been built on the rivers, controlling their flow, creating artificial lakes where the water once ran free. Electricity hums across transmission lines that were not there a century ago. And yet, the Tigris and Euphrates still rise in those same mountains to the north, still flow down from the same peaks where the wild horses and gazelles once ranged, before they were hunted to extinction or retreated to the very farthest margins of human habitation. The water still follows the same routes it has followed for millions of years, still seeks the lowest places, still nourishes life wherever it reaches. The rhythm of flood and drought still determines the success or failure of crops, just as it has since the first humans decided to plant seeds instead of gathering what nature provided. The same stars shine over the same hills. The North Star is in the same place in the northern sky. Orion still hunts across the heavens as winter turns to spring. The three bright stars of Orion's belt are still arranged in that recognizable pattern that has guided travelers and inspired stories for as long as humans have looked upward. The constellations that the builders of Göbekli Tepe saw on clear nights, and there would have been many clear nights in that climate with the air unfiltered by industrial haze and light pollution. Those same constellations are visible still to anyone who walks away from the electric lights and looks upward into the darkness. The cosmic order has not changed. The celestial rhythms continue as they always have, indifferent to human empires, indifferent to the rise and fall of civilizations, indifferent even to our arrival and our departure, indifferent to our struggles and our achievements, and our brief, burning lives. As you lie here in the darkness, your body resting against your pillow, your head sinking deeper into its softness, your blankets arranged around you in a cocoon of warmth and safety, consider what it would have been like to rest under those same stars. Imagine the people of Göbekli Tepe as evening fell, as the sun set over the distant hills, as the light faded from the sky and the first stars emerged. Imagine them gathering perhaps within the stone circles, for protection from the nighttime animals that moved through the darkness, or lying on simple beds of rushes and grass arranged around the temple, watching the sky above them. They would have seen meteor showers, those sudden streaks of light that seemed to carry messages from the realm beyond the clouds, that appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly, leaving only the memory of their passage. They would have tracked the moon through its phases, would have felt the pull of those tides in their own bodies, in the rhythms of their sleep and wakefulness and dreams, in the cycles of hunger and satiation and desire. They would have listened to sounds we can barely imagine now, the calls of animals we have driven extinct or near to extinction, the great herds moving through the darkness, the unfamiliar roars and cries of predators that were still numerous enough to be a constant presence. They would have heard the wind moving through forests and grasslands untouched by human industry, unbroken by human roads and structures. They would have heard the silence that came between sounds, the deep silence of night before any electric hum ever existed, before the constant drone of traffic and machinery that characterizes the modern world. And in that silence, in that darkness filled only with stars and the presence of the living world, they would have slept, just as you are sleeping now, their minds moving through dreams and journeys of the inner world, while their bodies rested and restored themselves. The body's need for sleep is ancient. It is older than language, older than art, older than the first moment when a human being decided to plant a seed instead of gathering what nature provided. It is written into the very blueprint of human being, and those early humans honoured that need fully, completely, without the guilt or resistance that so often surrounds rest in the modern world. In our modern understanding, we have come to believe that paradise must be a place we can return to, a destination we can reach if we only move far enough or climb high enough or work hard enough or earn enough money or achieve the right state of enlightenment. But what if that is a misunderstanding? What if the true nature of paradise is not a place you go back to but something you carry within? It is not a location on a map but a capacity. It is the human ability to find wonder even in ordinary things, to notice the light falling through leaves, to hear the song in a simple melody, to feel the touch of another's hand and know that we are not alone. It is the impulse to create beauty and meaning and community, the drive that pushes humans to paint and sing and dance and build, even when the immediate task of survival is complete. It is the yearning to reach toward transcendence, to create something larger than ourselves, to be part of something that matters. It is the drive to tell stories around fires, to make art on stone walls, to build temples and monuments not because we need them for survival, but because something in us requires it, compels it, demands that we create something that will last beyond our own brief years. When we look at Göbekli Tepe, we are not looking at the ruins of a lost paradise. We are looking at the evidence that even then, even in that hunter-gatherer culture, even in that time before agriculture and cities and complex hierarchies, humans were already doing what humans have always done. They were creating. They were reaching beyond the immediate needs of food and shelter and safety and reaching towards something transcendent. They were saying, through stone and carving and the enormous labour of building, that meaning matters, that beauty matters, that connection matters, that something in us requires more than mere survival. We do the same thing now. We do it every time we create anything, every time we make something from nothing, every time we sing a song or write a word or arrange flowers in a vase or organise our home in a way that pleases us. Every time we reach toward each other in love or friendship or simple kindness, we are participating in the same impulse that drove the builders of Göbekli Tepe to spend countless hours shaping stone. The paradise we lost is not outside us. It is not a place we can return to or a time we can travel back to. It is inside us, in the same DNA that carries the genetic memory of countless generations, in the same capacity for wonder and dreaming that those ancient humans possessed, in the same ability to create meaning and find transcendence in a world that often seems to offer none. When you create something, when you love someone, when you notice beauty, when you rest peacefully, you are participating in that same ancient impulse. You are continuing the work that began at Göbekli Tepe. You are honouring the memory of those people by embodying the capacity they embodied, the capacity to reach beyond mere survival towards something greater. You are descended from those people, not metaphorically, not spiritually in some vague sense, but literally. The DNA that sits in every cell of your body, the genetic code that determines your eye colour and your height, and the shape of your hands and the colour of your hair, and the very structure of your brain, contains sequences of information that have been copied and passed down from generation to generation across 12,000 years. There have been perhaps 400 generations between you and the people who built Göbekli Tepe, and in each generation, the code was copied and transmitted, preserved and passed along. This means that you carry, quite literally, the inheritance of those people. You have a part of them in you. The same impulses that drove them to create beauty and gather in community and reach toward transcendence are alive in you. They flow through you with every heartbeat. The same need for rest that they honoured fully and naturally is alive in you. The same capacity for dreams is alive in you. When you sleep, your mind does what their minds did when they slept. You dream. Your brain processes the experiences of your day, consolidates memories, makes new connections, organises the vast flood of information into patterns and meanings, repairs itself, and readies itself for another cycle of wakefulness and activity. This is not a modern function added onto human nature by civilization. This is ancient. This is built into the very structure of what it means to be human. This is something we share with every human who has ever lived. This is the common inheritance of all people, the unbroken thread that connects you to farmers and kings and philosophers and stone carvers and all the billions of humans whose bodies have rested and whose minds have dreamed. And so the memories persist, carried forward not just in stories and art and archaeology and the physical evidence of Göbekli Tepe, but in the deepest structure of human being itself. There is something in us that remembers paradise, something that longs for a simpler relationship with the world, something that hears the word gardened and feels a pull towards something we cannot quite name. This longing is real. It is not weakness. It is not failure or regression. It is the echo of something true. It is the recognition that something valuable was lost when we transformed our relationship with the earth and with each other, when we moved from gathering what nature provided to forcing nature to provide what we demanded, when we created hierarchies and inequalities and the constant pressure to produce and accumulate. We have built civilizations of extraordinary complexity and beauty on the foundation of the agricultural revolution. We have learned to compose symphonies and write novels and create medicines that cure disease. We have sent humans to the moon and learned to speak instantly across continents. And alongside all of this, we have also created pressures and anxieties and disconnections from the natural world that our bodies were not designed to endure for such sustained periods. The stress and the rushing and the constant stimulation that characterizes modern life is not what our nervous systems expect. Our bodies are still, in many ways, the bodies of people who moved with the herds and the seasons, who rested when the sun set, who felt connected to the earth and the sky and the flow of water. We have not biologically adapted to the modern world, even though we have created it. We are still shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution that took place in natural environments, under natural rhythms, in communities of known faces. This is not a reason for despair. It is simply a reason for compassion, for understanding, for honouring the parts of ourselves that long for rest and simplicity and connection. It is a reason to allow ourselves to rest without guilt, to sleep without shame. Rest is not laziness. Sleep is not failure. These are things your body needs, things your mind needs, things that are essential to your health and your well-being, things that are as important as food and water and the air you breathe. When you sleep, you are not wasting time. You are not being unproductive or lazy or failing to meet expectations. You are doing the most important work there is. You are allowing your body to repair and restore itself. You are allowing your mind to process and integrate and dream. You are participating in an ancient rhythm that extends back through all of human history, back through your ancestors to those first people who lay under stars and drifted into sleep while the world continued its slow turning around them. Give yourself permission to rest fully tonight. Let the weight of your body sink deeper into your mattress with each breath. Feel the warmth of your blankets surrounding you. Feel how they hold you gently and keep you safe. Feel the softness of your pillow beneath your head, supporting you, comforting you. There is nothing you need to do right now. There is nowhere you need to go. There is no one judging you or expecting anything of you. This time is yours. This moment belongs to you alone. You are safe here. You are warm here. You are exactly where you need to be. Thank you for spending your evening with the Calm Archive. Thank you for walking through time with me, for considering the possibility of Eden as a real place, a real memory, a real part of human inheritance. Thank you for allowing yourself to imagine Göbekli Tepe and the people who built it and the world they inhabited. If this journey through history and geography and the landscape of collective memory has helped you find peace tonight, helped you settle into rest, helped you drift towards sleep more gently and completely, helped you release some of the tension and worry that you carry, I would be deeply grateful if you would subscribe to this channel. I upload regularly, and there is always something new waiting for you whenever you need it. New histories, new landscapes, new stories to help you rest and restore yourself. In the comments below, I would love to hear what you think. Do you believe that Eden was a real place? Do you think that the memory of paradise is carried in us, in some deeper part of ourselves? Do you find that the thought of ancient gardens and quiet civilizations helps you let go of the tensions of the day? Share your thoughts. I read every comment, and your perspective matters, your voice matters, you are part of this community. And now, as we come to the very end of this story, as you lie deeper in your bed with each passing moment, I want to leave you with an image. Hold this image in your mind as you drift towards sleep. Let it guide you gently into the dream realm. Picture Göbekli Tepe as it is at night, when the last visitors have gone and the sun has set over the distant hills, turning the sky first orange and then purple and then finally black. The stone temple stands silent under the sky, the T-shaped pillars reaching upward into the darkness like a prayer or a memory or a wish sent out into the cosmos. The stones are cool and still and ancient. The stars are brilliant here, far from city lights, burning with a clarity that seems impossible, the Milky Way itself visible as a great river of light flowing across the heavens from horizon to horizon. The wind moves through the grass and the sparse shrubs, and it carries with it the scent of earth and stone and time, the scent of something vast and enduring. The Tigris and Euphrates flow invisibly in the valleys below, their waters moving steadily toward their ancient destination, their sound a distant whisper in the darkness, a constant reminder that even in the stillness, life continues to flow. Everything is quiet. Everything is still. The busyness of human civilization exists elsewhere now, in distant cities and towns, in the glowing screens and rushing streets of the modern world. Here, at Göbekli Tepe, at the resting place of this ancient temple, there is only silence and stone and sky. The garden is gone. We know this. The wild abundance has given way to ordered fields and managed landscapes. The way of life that built this temple, that carved these stones, that led to the community gatherings and the ritual celebrations and the bringing together of people in service of something greater than themselves, that way is gone, transformed, lost into the past where all things eventually go. But something endures, the stones endure, the memory endures. The human capacity to create and dream and reach toward transcendence endures. The need to rest and restore and sleep endures. And you, lying here in your bed, warm under your blankets, safe in the darkness, your body heavy with the approach of sleep, are part of that continuous chain. You're connected to those stone carvers and hunters and dreamers of 12,000 years ago. The same life force moves through you. The same need for rest and restoration moves through you. The same capacity for wonder moves through you. Everything that they were, you are. Everything that they created, you inherit. You are part of their story. Their story is your story. The past lives in you. The night deepens around you now. Your eyelids grow heavier with each moment. The thoughts that occupied your mind earlier, the concerns and worries and plans of your daily life, begin to drift away like clouds moving across an evening sky, drifting slowly and gently toward the horizon and disappearing into the distance. There is no need to hold on to them now. They will still be there if you need them tomorrow, but tonight they can rest, and so can you. Your breathing becomes slower, deeper, more natural with each cycle. Each breath is like a small reminder that you are safe, that your body knows how to care for itself, that all the mechanisms of rest and restoration are working perfectly without any effort or intention on your part. You can simply allow this. You can simply let yourself descend into the layers of sleep, knowing that somewhere in the darkest depths of your mind the ancient stories continue. The memories of paradise persist. The inheritance of human dreaming and striving and creating and yearning continues, and you are part of it all. You are woven into it. You are home. Sleep now. Sleep deeply and peacefully. Sleep as if you were resting under the stars at Göbekli Tepe, as if the stones themselves were protecting you, as if the accumulated wisdom of 12,000 years of human existence was gathered around you like a blanket, warming you, comforting you, telling you that everything is exactly as it should be. Your ancestors slept, your parents slept, your children will sleep, and now you sleep, carrying forward the great human journey into dreams and rest in the mysterious realm that opens only when we close our eyes and let go of the waking world. The garden is gone, but the memory endures, and so do you. Sleep now. Everything is safe. Everything is well. Everything is at peace. You are at peace. Rest now.